Sup, my fellas, don't forget to leave feedback, and enjoy the story. In front of us is a Samal, two people standing on a cliff, apparently a father and son. The father asks the son what he thinks, what dignity is most important for the Lord. Our hero asked if this could be generosity, but my father only said that this was not a bad answer, but still the main quality is a kind heart. The man's name was Richard Folentia, Lord of Leshill. The son didn't understand what he was talking about, but father said that the dignity a lord should have depends on the situation, a friend, a family member, and sometimes even a villain. Lords should always be able to play a lot of different people, and if you try in each of the possible situations, you can form a connection with any person. However, while they were chatting, at the same time, a certain person came running and said that he had something to say. The Lord understood what he was asking, so at the same time, he asked to move away from him, and then immediately got into a stance and began to use a certain spell. Our hero knew exactly what was going to happen, so in a few seconds a lot of skeletons were summoned. They gave off an ominous aura, but the skeletons somehow looked incredibly kind, so they happily went to work right away and they immediately started moving the logs. Our protagonist knew that his father could only use the extra labor force because of his own abilities. After all, my father is a great necromancer. Necromancers are those people, special magicians, who can use dark and black magic. Many years ago, the Emperor of the Tal'aran Empire sent 50,000 soldiers to resist the influence of necromancers. In Kizan, 10 necromancers were sent against a huge army, only 10 of them. But all 50,000 were simply turned into undead as well and ravaged the Tal'aran Empire themselves. The end of the so-called Pink Tramp eventually forced the Empire to retreat, and the rotting corpse of the first emperor met its miserable end on the throne of the Imperial Hall. So the necromancers started a new era and occupied half of the continent. But the dominance of necromancers was threatened by another power that ruled the other half of the continent, the Saints, the only enemy of necromancers, using theology to serve the goddess Dave. On the continent, a shaky peace is maintained between these two forces, but all this does not concern the life of our main character. After all, he lives in the Forest Hill, where necromancers live with ordinary people in harmony. This is generally a small town, which is not known even in the neighboring villages. But the main character's name is Simon Folentia, and he is the heir to the owner of this place. By the time Simon got home, he was met by his mother, whose name was Anna. Ree had just managed to make a soup infused with water and lesark mushrooms. Of course, you might think that these mushrooms are poisonous, but Anna said that everything will be fine because with the help of her magic, she will make them edible. Simon couldn't believe that his mother could surprise him every time. He can't even understand how his father, an incredible necromancer, and his mother, who could have been a priest, even became a couple. However, at the same moment, Madishka still turned her son away from his thoughts and called him to eat at the table. As soon as our protagonist sat down at the table, he again began to watch the picture of his father devouring all the food in just 1 second. However, the main thing that bothered our protagonist was that his parents were living too harmoniously together as if they were still on their honeymoon. As soon as the door to our character's room was closed, as soon as he wished everyone good night, a letter flew in his face. It was quite painful. What is it? Right at this moment, a certain girl was lying in front of him, clearly attracting attention. But instead of asking her about everything, Simon just walked over to his bed. Of course, the girl was not happy with this. She asked to stop ignoring her and immediately move on to the conversation. As soon as our protagonist decided to talk to her, that the girl started introducing herself, he said that she had come to see him, Simon Folentia himself. How does the girl even know that name? But as soon as the girl started talking, her parents came into the room. Of course, the girl was very happy to meet. She immediately called the names of her parents, and her parents knew her name, Nephthys. Immediately, Richard lifted Nephthys into his arms and began twirling her around as if she were his second daughter. However, Nephthys was immediately staged and presented as the legendary Nephthys Archbold. At the same time, our protagonist was covered in sweat, because if this name really belongs to this girl, then this means that this is the same Nephthys, the main reason why the Emperor of the Tal'aran Empire turned into a corpse puppet, and also a witch who has lived on Earth for more than 300 years. At the same time, the girl began to say that she was actually the great and terrible one, so our main character had no choice but to open this letter and read that he was invited to Kizan. As soon as Nephthys said this with a satisfied face, she immediately flew out through the window. Everyone was a little confused, but our hero's father asked to see this letter. Simon immediately asked his father to read it, so it was read that by special admission, Simon Folentia would be invited to the school or the Dark Alliance Center in Necromancer General Headquarters, just like the school. Nephthys is the chancellor of this school, although she doesn't look like such a person. But where is this place located at all? My father immediately replied that it was located quite far away, approximately on the island of Roke, so we would even have to take a ship in another kingdom, Dresden, and make quite a long way to the island. But the father immediately put his hand on his son's shoulder and told him not to worry, because there are a lot of interesting things in that place, and the island is not a boring place. Moreover, Kizan is famous for its stylish shape. Of course, this took our main character, but the mother immediately said that in this case, he would be very busy until the enrollment ceremony. After all, if all this happens in reality, then you should at least prepare yourself properly. You will have to learn skills at school, and to do this, you should open the core. Our character stood in confusion as the father and mother discussed who would have to teach their son the basics of black magic. That you'll have to learn some breathing techniques so you can forget about sleep altogether starting tomorrow. So now, after that very meeting with Nefties that day, the most difficult day of Simon's life began, the week of preparation for admission. Mom and Dad were saying good things about school life and how fun it would be, but the sudden arrival of invitations to school seemed to worry everyone. At one point, however, the kernel was opened. Simon didn't sleep 3 days a week while he formed the core with his father's magic. In the remaining days, he studied breathing and took his father's blitz course on black magic. A week later, he is a boy who has spent his entire life in a small forest and finally sets out on his journey. My mother, of course, was very upset about this, but there was nothing else to do. Our protagonist did not rest during the journey either. He remembered his father's words about how to still manage his mana and core. He remembered that he had to channel the magic power needed in the space around him into his body and slowly start adjusting his mana. Then you had to push it through your core and that was it. Only then could you feel the mana getting stronger inside your body. This sensation should be directed to the tips of your fingers. Of course, all this turned out for our hero, because his father said that this is the main power of Necromancer's darkness. This is the main difference between a Necromancer and an ordinary magician. After all, mana is something similar to gas, which makes it able to dissolve in air, and also reduces the density. Darkness, on the contrary, is more similar to a solid or liquid body. For this reason it is easy to use and change its shape. So if Simon can still learn how to use these properties of darkness, he can create any shape he wants. People who train their power in the dark base are called teams. Given that our main character won't have much time right now, it's better to just focus on the basics of putting darkness into the core. Once these words were said, our character kept shaping the core over and over again. Of course, it was strange that the father looked so worried, but he certainly didn't look so sorry for his son, who was not doing well, but quite the opposite. He understood that it usually took between 6 months and 2 years to create a form out of darkness, but our hero was just able to reach such a huge level in just 3 days. Richard knew that his son was talented, but such talent could also have side effects. Richard had delayed building his core, hoping that he wouldn't repeat the mistakes of his youth, but right now, his talent definitely needed to flourish. It was at this point that Simon was able to recreate something in his hand. He asked his father to look at it, to which he replied that the color of his son's darkness is a beautiful blue light. Simon immediately asked if it was a good thing that it had this color, could it be that he was talented, or was it a rare gift? But the father immediately said that it was just a beautiful color, which upset his son. At this moment, the carriage stopped, and the gentleman was asked to get out of the carriage. Richard said that although they didn't come to Kaizen, they came to the border of the Dresden kingdom. Now our protagonist must go his own way. Richard was very apologetic for not being able to say it earlier, but he just can't remember this quality because it has its own history. From now on, Simon must make his own decisions. The father asked his son not to worry because he will cope with everything, and besides, the father believes in him. The carriage left immediately, and I could only hope that everything would be alright with my father. By the time the coachman said they were there again, they finally arrived a week later in the kingdom of Dresden, Langenstein. Our main protagonist could not believe that such a huge city even exists, that you need to be more careful. However, he needed to get to 239 Camel Road, which is exactly where the guide is waiting for him. But where is it anyway? At the same time, he turned to one of the women in front of him. The lady immediately turned around, and you could see that her eye had fallen out of its socket, which scared Simon very much. He immediately started shaking. The girl immediately looked at the map with her own eye and pointed her finger at a certain huge area that would be one of the attractions of Langenstein. Simon immediately thanked the lady and then set off on his way. A certain girl was already very much waiting for someone, but our character again got into a certain and very uncomfortable situation. He was surrounded by many people, which could mean that he would arrive in Kaizen a little later. An hour before that, our protest was looking at people and asking about their path, so at one point a man with a shaved head came up to Simon and said that he saw him off, but this time he lost our hero, so he went in search of him. They immediately shook hands. The guide took our main character to an alley, saying that there are people in these alleys who like to cash in on tourists. However, Simon immediately said that this was exactly what they wanted to cash in on. The man immediately started saying that he didn't understand what our hero was talking about at all. So Simon immediately said that the man looked down and around very strangely, that he was always checking his pocket, which probably contained a dagger. And most likely, he doesn't even know that he chose the name of the goat from his city. The bald pickpocket immediately started shouting and saying that then he didn't understand why they had followed him in the first place. He immediately took out a knife and began to turn out his pockets because our hero was surrounded on all sides. But at the same moment, our main character said that he refused. People around him started saying that the kid probably didn't understand anything. Immediately they came at him with knives, but Simon dodged and grabbed the offender by the arm and said that before he had met the same as them, scum wandering among normal and good people, and then tore them apart. His duty as a descendant of landowners is to deal with such garbage as they do. At the same time, a lot of people came out of the Bin's home, which made it clear to Simon once again that he would arrive at the place later. However, just as he thought about it, a certain girl showed up and said that she had finally found the person she said she had. She also noticed that he probably had something to deal with. The bald pickpocket immediately asked everyone to calm down, because they had a benefit in the number of people, so it was only necessary to quickly finish sleeping with one and then break through to the second. Only here the girl clearly made it clear that there was a shop with skeletons right next to them. As soon as the humans started to be defeated by the skeletons, they started asking for help. The girl asked for the name of her clan, so people had to give out that they were from the Claven clan, which also confused the girl. After all, this was too big a clan for its Elchens to steal from travelers. The girl asked me to convey her words to her head that he should lower his head to the ground, put his hands behind his back and crawl face down to the main headquarters to surrender personally. The bald man asked for mercy, but the girl only became more angry. She said that it was her order, and she would not tolerate that her order was not followed. Then she immediately turned to Simon and told him that she was a real guide. She took the hand of our main character and said that now they will go to her mother. Our main character could not believe who the mother of this girl is. But after a second, it became clear that her mother was Nephtes, who just went to get another portion of ice cream. Mother and daughter began to quarrel because what would happen if my mother lost? This was all very confusing for Simon, but there was nothing to be done, so Nephtes asked if our hero had learned anything. As soon as she said that, our character took out his flame, which surprised both of them. It had been a long time since they had seen a dark shade of blue, and even with mana stats. It was at this point that Nephtes asked Lorraine to guide the new student to the school while the best witch herself went to serve her ice cream. At the same time, Lorraine introduced herself. Like Lorraine Archbold, she's also a student at Kaizen and now they're going shopping. At the same time, as soon as they were both outside the store, Lorraine asked if our protagonist knew the best moment of the entire school year. After all, if not, then it's just buying clothes, books, and everything stronger for school. You should just enjoy it properly. First, you'll need to follow Lorraine and buy a lot of textbooks. Many textbooks were heavy, incomprehensible in design, and there were really a lot of them. But is it really all for 1 year? But Lorraine just smiled and said that all these books were going to be learned in the first semester, and now it was not necessary to include Slab at all and it was worth continuing to catch books. Of course, despite the absurdity of the situation, Simon liked so many people and he was looking forward to the school year. However, as soon as he started to move away from his books, he noticed that a certain girl was hanging around him who almost collided with our character. Our Simon managed to react and immediately stop, but the girl just took and crashed into a rack of books. The impact was heavy, so many books started to fall off the counter. These books might have left a bump on the girl's head, but Simon decided it was best to block them with his body. He thought that he was to blame for this incident, but still asked to put the books in their place. He realized that this was probably a new girl in Cadmium, too, so the girl RP'd Establast like Cindy Vives. Our main character also introduced himself, but the girl was a little shy and said that she was from the north of Shakedaw, so she didn't have any friends yet. Simon also revealed that they were in the same boat, which made Cindy very happy. She immediately lowered her head and said that if Simon didn't mind, she would like to say hello to him at school. Simon didn't mind, because he also wanted to ask for it. Cindy immediately said that she would go, because her father was waiting for her outside. As soon as the girl turned around, our character called Cindy's blade and asked her for one more thing. He asked for his wallet back. Cindy was taken aback, because how did he know what she'd done? She thought that if she used spiritual magic, she would definitely not be caught. But did he just notice it, or did he choose spiritualism? The girl immediately began to ponkin, and then her strength returned again, and she said that she could not believe that she would study with such students in Cajun. She started jumping around the library and started saying that if they both chose spiritualism, they could see each other every day for 3 years in a row, and then immediately threw the purse into our hero's hands, saying that she was waiting for them both to meet at school. As soon as Cindy left, Lorraine came back and said that the library had finished copies of Introduction to the Dynamics of Darkness, and asked what kind of girl was that next to him, did he make friends? But at the same time, when Simon said that everything seemed to be true, Lorraine asked to be open with her, because if you like someone, you can tell her. Of course, Lorraine did that, but then she said that if it was all over, then it would be worth dealing with the bag, because it would not be the bag that ordinary people use. but the one called magic equipment or subspace. Our main character just caught fire with this purchase, so after a few minutes they came to a very pretty woman who was selling just some rings with subspace. Lorraine said something that surprised the old lady, which only meant that they were all familiar with the ring's data. After a few seconds, the old lady showed a certain ring, saying that such as it is still not on sale, but it can still be sold. Simon immediately tried it on, and then the old lady asked for it to be infused with mana. Once the mana was infused, there was a certain lever that was worth pulling. As soon as the lever was pulled, a certain space on the floor opened up. Lorraine asked how much they should pay Calco for it. Stephanie immediately replied that they would owe about 5,000 gold, which was very much over budget. Our main character started saying that it was a lot, but Lorraine said it was fine because it was her mom's money. She doesn't know the details, but it seems that her mom owes Simon's parents a huge debt, so she's just paying it back. Don't even think about it. If he's going to thank Lorraine's mom, all he has to do is study hard. At this point, both characters went outside and Lorraine offered to have a little fun, which is also included in their graph. Kay, of course, at this point they began to have a conversation. They visited attraction after attraction and ended up at the thousands of lights that are turned on every year. Lorraine believed that her new friend would be able to cope in a new place. By then, Lorraine and Simon were sitting at the table in front of us. Lorraine was surprised that her new friend was as straight-faced at the table as any nobleman. But our protagonist said that all this was taught to him by his father. Of course, Lorraine immediately said that this was very good, and so that he would understand that only 30% of the students are ordinary people. But still, Kaizen is built on a system of equality, so are there any questions about the first day of training? Simon immediately decided to ask about that girl from the library, because they were talking about profiles, so Lorraine immediately started saying that the first semester of the first year would be 9 years. Starting from the second semester, you can choose only those disciplines that you want to attend, but when you move to the second year, you will need to choose a profile. It is on this principle that you should choose your future employment. After all, when it comes to working in groups, students with pure strength are especially popular. Do you have any thoughts on Simon's profile at all? But he only said that he was interested in the vocation because what Lorraine showed him was just wonderful. Lorraine said it was really fun because it made you feel like you were a devout magician. One of the case's deans is Professor Honkyong. Lorraine is still afraid of him, and the other professors are really cool, too. So the conversation went on until nightfall, when the two heroes should have already escaped to their dorms, which is exactly what Lorraine was talking about. Simon thanked her very much for such a good time, and even said that he would never forget this day for the rest of his life. However, as soon as they were about to leave, Lorraine became embarrassed and said that there was something else she would like to say, even if she missed the moment. She said that she was also new to the academy, so she asked for some friends in the academy. This information surprised our staff very much and left them in shock. However, after a few moments, we can already notice that he was near a lot of people on another morning. Everyone had a different style, they all climbed aboard the ship. But what's going on anyway? Why did so many people look at each other in this way? Why did anyone complain about anything at all? A certain man who introduced himself as Lucius Carroll, heir to the Countship of Dresden, is not the first on the list. However, this person was asked to step aside and was told that he was not on the list of eligible people. At the same time, this Lucius was about to hit the elf, but Simon stopped him. The nobleman couldn't understand what they were doing to him at all, but our protagonist only tightened his grip. An old man named Sillage appeared. The professor asked the guy to name his last words, but Lucius started to say that the list was not very correct and asked him to call Nefties. But at the same time, the professor waved his hand and went back to the ship. Simon looked at him, but the professor asked him not to worry because that guy would still be breathing by the time everyone had already taken their seats on the ship. The professor was able to show everyone his aura, but how did this ship even float to the meeting place? We'll have to back up to get out to sea. But just as everyone was starting to wonder, a huge whale jumped out of the sea and swallowed the ship. It was an underwater undead that worships only the order of Kaizen, a whale from the underworld. At this moment, all the students were in the whale's stomach. This was the monster that floats across the ocean through West Weep and bites off a portion of any port Kaizen pointed out. And once a year, it transports new students to the school as a high-speed transport. Many people could not even think that inside the vein it would be so pleasant that in general someone would even dare to live there. Sure enough, the person who was sitting next to our protagonist said that they were in an uncomfortable situation, but now they can finally step outside. This booth was presented as Rovan. He is the same student as Simon. However, what exam did our main character take? Of course, our protagonist didn't pass any exam, he was just handed a letter, so he decided to say that he did the same thing with the darkness. By then, there was an announcement that they would soon be able to arrive at their destination. The water became rougher and the ship began to shake, so the professor asked no one to get up from their seats. As a security measure, it would be worth doing something at all. However, as soon as everyone calmed down a bit, Simon saw that a certain island had opened up in front of him. At the same time, the professor waved his fingers, saying that they were still there. He asked everyone to create a form and then pointed out where to go for men and where to go for girls. He asked them to change as quickly as possible and gather outside. Simon was glad because in fact the uniform was gorgeous. Many people talked about its properties, but still the girl's uniform was more beautiful. While our main character was walking forward, Rowan was standing behind him and saying that this uniform suits them very well, that he can't even believe that they are in this academy. And also the fact that there are a whole 1,000 students in the first class. In the second year, this number is reduced to 300, but in the third year, 150 is barely typed. He said that only the top 30% will be able to go to the second year, and there are a few people worth watching. For example, the official heiress of Ivory Tower and all the other rising stars, such as Darwin Carradine and Jay Sanders. But who was the big guy up ahead anyway? Of course it was the half-giant Shade L. Mayer. On the other side was the year's best student, Lorraine Archbold. Everyone thought that she had entered by special invitation since she was Nephthys' only daughter, but Rowan had heard that she had passed the exam with excellent grades. She didn't take first or second place on the test, but still felt that they were the best. By that time, everyone was being asked to pay attention because the ceremony was about to begin. The professor's show was beginning. Shoe covers came out first, but Simon was more upset that Nephthys wasn't there, even though such a great and famous chancellor might have come for the first years. At that point, the students were asked to stand up and take the oath given by the best student and female student. Who will it be? At this point, those who are called professors were asked to stand up, namely Serna Eindark, who was in the first enrollment, and then Simon. The entire room fell silent, but Simon and Rowan couldn't believe it. At the same moment, our main character immediately got up from his seat. Half of the entire new school started looking around at him. As soon as Simon walked out to the girl standing next to him, a strange feeling came over him. However, at the same time, the girl who was standing next to them asked not to worry. She said that they should just read the very message that they were given. At the same time, both students raised their hands and began to recite their vows in unison. After this incident, classes began that our hero simply could only guess about. He couldn't believe that all 14 classrooms would be packed for the entire day. But what annoyed him most was that almost every student in the school was talking about him. The first day of school, and our protagonist is already on pins and needles. But what was his first lesson? As soon as his notebook was opened, you could see that the first lesson was summoning magic, which is the same magic that his father uses. This means that if he takes this course, he will become exactly the same as him. Simon just lit up. At the same time, the teacher came out, thinking that some people associate necromancers with dark and gloomy figures who command corpses in the dark. But this is all in the past, because modern necromancers are smarter, more practical, stylish, and fashionable. This was a new generation of necromancers. Now it was Bahal Amager, Catarology, a first-year professor of Catarology, a young necromancer who rose to the stars and became a crown lord until the age of 30. He is an idol with unsurpassed popularity among Kizan's students. At the same time, Bahal began to say that he would teach his lesson to everyone in the first year of training. The entire Tutu class immediately started shouting with pleasure until the roll call of each other started. Bahal said that since everyone sees each other for the first time, when they say someone's name, they will need to get up from their seats. At the same time, there was the audience imposed on James Vikitoria. The girl was very happy. She immediately got up from her seat and started shouting that she would like to become just like her teacher. 1-year-old Bahal asked her to hold back the horses for a while, and then introduce herself as if she was telling her friends all this and not her teacher. Levushka immediately introduced herself, so Simon was next, and everyone looked at him with envy. Of course, the roll call ended pretty quickly, and Bahal thought everyone was just adorable, so that was the reason to start the lesson. He asked why they were even learning his lesson. Can anyone define a curse at all? James Victoria raised her hand and started saying that a curse is a type of dark magic that supports the caster's strength and weakens the opponent. Of course, Bahal praised. He said that some students wouldn't be able to imagine it after hearing only weaken the opponent, so Bahal decided to give an example. He said that there are two knights with similar powers and skills. They start exchanging punch after punch, pulling each other out along the way. They have already done 20 strikes each, but no one has given up, and at that moment one of them starts shouting loudly, looking at the other knight with a bloodthirsty look. That warrior turned pale and shuddered, so that at last the enemy's sword passes over his enemy's shoulder and he begins to bleed and tremble. The knight tries to take advantage of his chance to win. He corners the opponent and punches them in the legs to prevent them from moving, throws sand in their eyes, and hits their helmet with knives to fight back. In Odin, the moment becomes really violent and the head of one of the knights flies off his shoulders. At the same time, Baal turned to his class and asked if they understood that even a primitive fight is a series of actions that weaken the opponent in order to get closer to victory step by step. Now it was necessary to demonstrate how ordinary mid-level necromancers fought. On the board was a drawing of a person to be defeated by the necromancer. After a split cheekbone, for some reason, A person was crossed out, the whole class just exploded in surprise, and Bahel began to say that the curse has the simplest structure among various spells because another feature is fast application. In addition, it is effective, so you can shake the opponent without making much effort. At the same time, Shoe Covers came up to one of the students and used a curse on him. The apprentice passed out, and Bahel took out his knife and hinted that this is how necromancers fight. Bahel immediately broke the spell on our student after the student screams and said that more than 80% would probably take his lectures next semester because he has excellent compatibility with other subjects. Bahel just wanted to be taught his specialty because no one else could give them the opportunity to curse their enemies. It is his subject that is considered the main one, and the main reason to study it is the priests. It is his item that is the best way to fight the enemies of necromancers. Of course, at this point, Bahel stood up in front of the entire class and said that necromancers have a curse, but priests have a blessing. Their difference is that one spell weakens the target while the other increases it. Can someone explain why a curse is better than a blessing? James raised her hand again and said that the curse was applied faster, which was why it worked faster. Bahel said that this is an interesting opinion, but still said that it is wrong. He said that if you only consider the speed of casting a spell, then the academics agree that a curse that passes through the opponent's resistance is slightly slower than a priest's blessing. But can anyone else give it a try? At the same moment, Hector Moore raised his hand. He said that there is practically no one who can correct their weakness through training. Bahel asked for his name again, so as soon as Hector reminded him, Bahel promised to remember it and said that he said it correctly because weakening spells can't be removed with training. All of them are trained assuming that they are in normal condition, and the evaluation of the tip depends on the quality of their application. So, taking into account all external factors, they are simply under their own control. People are more sensitive than they look. Bahel said that they can break even from the slightest changes, so in other words, it is not necessary to cut off the arm of the archer who is aiming at them to win. You can simply worsen his vision with the help of an eye disease, or make him nervous, turn his head. Disrupt the sense of distance or distract attention with another goal. You can even avoid getting hit by an arrow that flies at you. Bahel said that necromancers have a huge amount that can degrade the target's condition. After all, when someone has a stomach ache or is just tired, how many people are willing to train just to resist it? Of course, almost not at all, because many people would just make themselves a day off. Bahel asked everyone to think about how to weaken the enemy, not how to strengthen themselves. So, since everything is ready, the professor asked to bring their study guide to the room. As soon as a certain book and plant were entered, Simon was shocked that they would do it from the first lesson. Of course, Bahel continued to talk about what for a disciple of Kizan it was rather embarrassing to use a correction device, but this was their first class, so there was nothing they could do. This was all according to the protagonist's self-assessment, but there was nothing else to do, so just ask the shoe covers to start designing from the point of exhaustion. It was necessary to grasp the handles of the device and squeeze your darkness into mold. The key to a successful magic circle was how perfectly the first word of the rune could be created. Simply put, runes are a magical power. When someone draws rune words with the help of darkness, you can put magical properties into them. So now that the circle was formed, it needed to be lifted up. Simon did just that. He thought that he had succeeded, but after a moment, as soon as he noticed what the other students were also doing, his circle just spilled out on the table. Bahel said that if this was the case, it was likely that the disciple had not cleared his mana circle in this way, so it was necessary to try until the circle remained in the air. Each of the students had to damage the flower with a correction device. It was necessary to aim precisely at him and only then everything changed. At this point, many students could cope with this task over and over again, but not our character. Bahel said that of course he sees the difference between students. He said that if someone succeeds, then you need to repeat the spell faster to create a circle as best as possible. However, why does our hero do nothing at all? What does he do wrong? He has plenty of mana, so it's worth trying exactly the way Nephthys and Lorraine advised him to. He realized that he would not immediately send mana to the core, but simply gather as much of it as he could. At the same time, he introduced all the things that he was taught and a second later activated everything on the flower. Of course, the flower shrank. To more alone, I didn't like it. At this point, Bahel said that practice was ending, so if someone didn't even make it, then it's worth practicing when he returns to the dorm. At the same time, Bahel even said that they would put it all into practice, because this class even has the right specially invited student. Bahel asked Simon to step forward at the same time. Then Bahel decided to test out who would be a good opponent for our character, so he decided to call Hector Moore. The rules were announced. You need to use the depletion spell as best you can. The winner is the one whose knees and buttocks first touch the ground. At this point, Hector asked not to use his curse with the device, so Bahel appreciated the request. Of course, Hector looked pretty smart and he had a good build, which amused shoe covers a lot because he was even able to show off after his words. But what about Simon? Simon said that he would stay with the device, so as soon as shoe covers announced that it was time to start, our character immediately began to collect his mana on the device. But it was already very late, because you could see that his vision began to deteriorate, his legs began to shake. One could conclude that Hector had accomplished his mission. Our protagonist also didn't want to waste any time, he also tried to recreate the circle. Time after time, his form failed, and Hector continued to use exhaustion on his opponent. BSK said that the invited student was just garbage, could not use a single curse. But Hector continued to sneer and say that if he did not want to give up, he would be forced to show the end. Bahel looked at all this and knew that Hector was a valuable student. He will be exactly the one who survives to the 3rd year. On the other side was Simon, who had no training, no basic knowledge of dark magic, let alone a real expert in combat. Why did Nephthys choose him in the first place? After all, number 1, 2, 3, and 4 were invited. They didn't pass the difficult exam and they should be the talents of the century, especially number 1. They were always personally chosen by Nephthys and they always became outstanding figures in their field. But now the shoe covers cannot notice something pronounced in the actions of our main character. It was an ordinary student who withstood just a lot of curses. At one point, however, it was apparent that Simon was able to raise his magic circle and cast exhaustion. So as soon as the exhaustion hit Hector, he immediately fell to the ground. He couldn't believe the exhaustion could be so severe. He hadn't even felt this way before. However, Hector believed that he couldn't lose. He said that he would definitely finish off his opponent and then used another curse. Of course, Bahel said that the fight was over and Hector was the winner. He said they would meet again. When the lesson was also over, the professor was approached by a girl who asked to answer her question, but Bahel only replied that he could answer the ambassador of lessons in the office. But he really thought that he couldn't waste his time with such a girl, because now he saw Simon's curse, which was better than all the praise. He was definitely interested in our main character. Such a genius should definitely devote himself to his subject. By that time, you could see that all the students were resting on the playground, and our protagonist was very depressed and looked tired. However, his friend said that this is most likely due not only to the fact that Simon is the best student in Nephthys' assessment, but also for the reason that every professor and students are fighting and have competition. Every professor gets penalized because his student did a bad job or something like that. But if academic performance increases, then the influence also grows up. Named for this reason, all professors try to pick up good students. This is the reason why our Simon was called every time. Everyone just wanted to test his skills and abilities. And the girl who is called Simon's rival is also called Maylene Willen. She's the best in the class and the best among the first years, so it's easy to find out what you're like by talking to her and testing yourself. All the professors were confused. They thought that Simon was just incredible, but he turned out to be an ordinary student. At the same time, our character asked for forgiveness and also thanked his interlocutor, but who is he? At the same time, the guy immediately started shouting and saying that he was Richard Highward, that they even introduced themselves in the same class. However, how does a student who was considered simply incredible feel in general, but in fact turned out to be ordinary? However, Simon didn't think there was anything wrong with that, since he had really just spent all his stamina in Professor Shoecover's class. Richard thought it was creepy, but our protagonist said it was a lot of fun. He said that even though it was very difficult, it was actually fun. Richard immediately went over to Simon and told him that he was weird and that there was a serious problem. He said that Hector is creating his own private group. Not only did he perform well, but he was also quite popular with the children of the nobility. Our hero said that he wasn't very interested, to which Richard said that he needed to get ready because politics and wagging are also important among students. What will happen when someone gets under Hector's influence? But our Simon interrupted him and asked him why he had come to see him instead of Hector. But Richard confessed that he was just a commoner from a merchant's family. Simon said there was nothing wrong with that. But Richard said again that there were still some kids who felt it was their duty to show off their status. So Richard asked me to join his group. In other words, he believes that Simon is simply hiding his talents. Our hero immediately got up from his chair and said that he was not sure about the closed group, but about becoming friends, you can think about it. Richard immediately started waving his hands and saying that such words were inconvenient to hear in Kazan, but because he was smeared, he said that making a friend would not be so bad. However, as soon as they both shook hands, Richard said that it was time for him to run to class. It was at this point that Simon realized that his next lesson would be summoning. He will definitely be able to summon the same creatures as his father. While our main protagonist was moving to his seat, all the students looked at him and said that he was the biggest farce in the history of Kazan. Presumably, many people even think that he is better than Lorraine, Shadel, and Cerna, which is considered simply absurd. Of course, Richard said not to listen to anyone. However, as soon as he looked at Simon, he noticed that he didn't give about all the people, he was looking forward to the lesson too much. At that moment, a certain person who looked more like a guy than a teacher entered the classroom. He said his name was Arendea, that he was their teacher. He immediately started saying that his lesson was the foundation of all necromancers and their history. Of course, the academicians don't admit it, but it was hard to admit it because they all originate from coffin bearers, coffin robbers, and so on. All this information shocked the students, but the teacher kept talking and said that if they thought his lesson was difficult, they were right. Of course, the teacher said that there are other metas, like excellent specializations, that should be taken up, but he is against such speeches. Everyone had to know the pros and cons of their subject. He said that the first disadvantage is that it is very expensive. You can't live without materials because they just can't kill people or animals for nothing. For this reason, they spend more than they get in return. The second disadvantage is that this item is highly dependent on creatures. After all, if you think about it that way, it's the creatures that you fight with. When they are destroyed, the summoner's power is reduced to 0. However, what's going to happen now that I'm using half-dead undead instead of bones? Of course, you take incredible financial damage. The third disadvantage is the fight with the priests, which is why summoning is not suitable for battle. The times when this discipline could realize itself and its full potential were during the World War. During a full-scale battle, summoners could obtain an infinite amount of undead crafting materials. But after the peace treaty, modern wars are carried out with the help of small isolated battles. This branch is simply weak, because one linked spell can defeat an entire army of undead. Jane held up her hand, wanting to ask about the pros, but the teacher only said that he didn't seem to be allowed to ask questions. But he still exhaled and said that it has strengths, like the number, use of tactics, and help from summoned creatures. To take this subject in the second semester, or not, to decide the students, but it was worth dreaming, only that it is not necessary to meddle in this case if you do not have the courage. If someone is going to cry, whine, and despair, or wants to ask a teacher to change their profile after the second year because of finances, or something else, then you can simply not think about getting a specialization with such an attitude. The teacher said that he would just exclude people who did so. At this point, all the students were provided with ratman bones. They had a similar person to humans, but it was the ratmen who were cheaper and simpler than humans. Most beginners in this field start with them. So once everyone was ready, everyone looked at the diagram from the board, then it was time to start. The teacher said that inside each skull there was a magic circle where magic had to be infused. However, the teacher didn't finish speaking, so he saw that the students were already terrified that the skeletons were already activated. Many of the students were actually scared, except for Simon, who had grown up as he was already used to the sight. The teacher also asked everyone to get used to it, because this is what they will have to do every day. He also said that if they want to continue working in this field, they should note that there are 206 bones in the human body, but only 53 in the ratman. So all you had to do is find the vertebra with the number 2 and attach it to the skull. Assembly does not cause any problems alone, because skeletons tend to become the same as they were before. Even if you make a mistake, you can then redo everything. By the time everyone was almost done with their skeletons, our Simon was able to assemble his first skeleton, while his Richard didn't understand why his skeleton was acting so strangely. At the same time, Simon came up to him and told him that he had not fastened his body properly. By then, the lesson was already over, so the teacher asked Simon to come out to the blackboard, as well as Hector. It is these two who will compete to collect the skeleton as quickly as possible. You couldn't use your hands or anything like that, because the main task was to pick up the necklace from the table. Our main character thought and believed that he would succeed. He definitely had to win this test. However, as soon as he looked at the board, they were all told not to cheat, that they should do everything in order. But the numbers are also gone. This is exactly what their teacher said, that this environment is not the easiest. Of course, Simon was determined not to give up, because he had just assembled the skeleton himself, so all he had to do was remember the sequence and the connections between the bones. He had to start with the second cervical vertebrae. Of course, at this point the teacher was looking at the two students. He realized that our protagonist had never assembled a skeleton in his life, but more probably just relies on order and structure, so he relies on memory and knowledge. And what he learned in the preparatory course obviously helps him, but he avoids mistakes in critical places thanks only to his intuition. Of course, Moore is talented, but what about someone who doesn't pass the test? What if he fails the assignment? Does he not even take the prep course? Hector is the only one in this class who has the talent for the professor's class. It was Hector who thought he'd win, that he'd finish. He was the one who hoped to smash our protagonist to smithereens so that he would never stand up to him again. He thought it was necessary to make a mockery of Simon to break the guy's confidence with a first pass. It was at this point that Hector's rat was done. It immediately climbed up on the table and took the necklace. If he didn't let it out of his hands in 5 minutes, he would definitely win. But our protagonist thought he could still do it. He thought about the fact that Hector went to prep school, so it's not surprising that he shows himself at his best. So instead of struggling to remember the knowledge from the lessons, Simon thought of just giving up. He had to follow his instincts himself. He immediately broke his mouse skeleton and decided that he would do everything by instinct again. No one could understand what he was doing. Did he give up? Maybe he didn't have the strength to continue. How did he become the first? But only Richard thought of Simon in a good way. He thought about and recalled the professor's words about taking the necklace with the skeleton instead of making the skeleton perfect. Samino also thought that he didn't have time. He had to forget about the complete structure and make it simple, giving it the ability to move. The mouse's forelimbs consisted of 20 numbers, so it would be better to get rid of the 30 seconds. The teacher noticed all this. He just couldn't believe that an ordinary student could guess to make a rat-like mouse from which they had evolved. Of course, the skeleton wasn't perfect, but it was undead and it didn't need to be in perfect order to move. How can a student even rely on personal experience rather than a course? Here something went wrong. Here the class erupted in screams with Simon's name. But Hector immediately realized that he couldn't stand it. He couldn't stand the fact that Simon was back in the spotlight, that he was no longer supported. Hector immediately ordered his skeleton to destroy our protagonist's skeleton. He thought he had won, but in fact our character took the chance in the arm, which was no longer part of the skeleton. The necklace was now in Simon's hands. Hector immediately started yelling at his teacher, saying that it was nonsense that he had asked to take the necklace with the skeleton, but in fact it was only a bone. But Simon immediately said that he didn't think so, that it was just a bone. And then a few seconds later, he recreated the skeleton again. He said it should work now, which put Hector in a very uncomfortable position. The professor, of course, when he saw all this, said that he'd had enough, that Simon was the winner. Our main character was just incredibly happy. He immediately lifted the skeleton of a mouse in the air and said that they finally won. At this moment, it was evening outside, and many teachers were gathering in the office to discuss the first-year students and other students who had talents. Some were able to make a potion, some were just good at it. However, what about the heiress of Ivory Tower? But the teacher only sighed and said that she now understood why the tower was so proud of her. That they understood everything about that half-giant, who seemed to have a hard time with magic, but that half-giant was very interested in using it. But how did Professor Bahil's lessons go anyway? Didn't he really have any? Bahil immediately took his cup of tea back and said that he had a class, and now he wanted to talk about the guy who had been chosen by Neftis. He'd obviously lost out to another student, but he wasn't sure he had such a fabulous talent. Of course, he had good stamina. He took out 9 curses in his first lesson, but that's definitely not for picking the best. However, did Aaron have a lesson? Aaron immediately poured a drink into his mug and was asked by Bahil how did he like the guy with special clearance. Aaron immediately started looking at his mug and said that this guy is slow, mediocre, but still has originality and creativity. A lot of people don't think this year's #1 is special, but what surprised Bahila more was that Aaron praised anyone at all. Aaron is known for his hard character, and for him to say that, the boy must really like him. All these adjectives that were used in relation to our protagonist are the best things you can hear from Aaron's mouth in life. He's the boy that Neftis chose and who could please the selective Aaron. This year is sure to get a lot more interesting. At that moment, Bahil, who had been very thoughtful a few seconds ago, turned to Aaron and asked if he was keeping his last year's words about never practicing with his students in person again. Aaron definitely turned pale, but that was when Neftis entered. Everyone thanked her, and Bahil even gave her an ice cream, which the Chancellor clearly liked. Of course, Neftis said that Bahil was a toady, but she liked it a bit that everyone was trying to please her. At the same moment she was given a chair. She immediately started asking if they had made sure all the students were confident, who had made the biggest impression, and so on. So Neftis asked to report back to her about all the problems, and since it was the first day of school, it was okay to go as early as possible. Aaron immediately turned to Neftis and said that he would like to talk to her about something. Neftis immediately said okay, she agreed. But what would he like to talk about? But of course Aaron said that he would only tell her when they were alone. Bahil believed that he always does that, but still Neftis will not tell him what he wants to know so easily. At the same moment, Richard and our protagonist decided to look at the seats that were left vacant, but realized that all were occupied by their classmates. After all, their class had lasted 3 hours. The girl apologized, but there were no rooms with 2 free seats left on the 2nd floor. But there was also nothing on the 3rd and 4th. Richard asked to exchange with someone, but our Simon only said that he wanted to look around on other floors. Of course, the girl decided to help since they all wanted to. But as soon as she began to move away, she was immediately bumped into by some guy who clearly made it clear that he valued himself above the girl. They asked why she was getting under his arm in the first place, making the girl blush time after time. She apologized, so Simon had to get into the conversation and say that they were talking to the girl in question, so it was all of them who arranged the collision. Richard also muttered something about them getting in the way and crashing on purpose. At that moment, the students realized that in front of them was the guy with the first special admission, who had taken the oath for the ceremony, so they immediately ran away. Of course, the left-handed girl at that very second, with a smile on her face, asked them to pass on. She said that there was actually a room with 2 vacancies on the 4th floor. It's pretty nice and it's close to the plate. Of course, the girl said that there were already some students in 409. She was excited, but the girl said that there was one Kajin Edwald in room 409. He was last year, so he just couldn't make it to the 2nd year. The girl even heard that he had some problems, so she had to start from the beginning. The caretaker immediately asked to come closer to her and told her that her former roommates had asked to switch rooms with someone. They had bruises on their eyes and so on. Richard asked to actually change their minds, but Simon said they should at least say hello. As soon as they entered the room, our character approached the bunk and asked if they could move in. There was a kid staring at them. He had a scar on his eye, and judging by his reaction to the new people, he realized that there was a ceremony of sorts. He asked to be addressed to him without formality since he was also a first-timer. He said that he didn't know how long these two would be at this school, but he asked him to keep 2 things in mind. First of all, don't poke your nose into his business, and secondly, don't make any noise when he goes to bed. Only when he's asleep can you start singing and so on. Richard was shocked, because didn't it mean that they could just stay in the room? At the same moment their neighbor decided to fall asleep, so our protagonist had no choice but to approach the caretaker and say that they were staying. The caretaker, of course, said that if there was any problem at all, they should go to her and she would immediately report to the manager. At the same moment Richard and Simon entered the room, Richard could not understand whether their commandant was asleep or not. But as he thought about it, his books fell to the floor, causing an incredibly loud noise. Of course, he was afraid that the boy would wake up, but in fact their neighbors didn't really wake up. Richard thought they had a pretty nice neighbor, so at that very moment he decided to check the bathtub on the 2nd floor. Our protagonist could not believe that there was a bathroom, and Richard, already walking on the wooden floor in the bathroom, asked, has he never seen a bathtub? Had he grown up so deep in the mountains? How much does he not know how to use a bathtub that he is always surprised? As soon as everyone had finished their business, Richard said that it was very good that our hero had gotten into this school, but whether they could stay here or not depended on their grades. Simon heard and was very afraid, because he knew that only 300 students reached the 2nd year. Richard confirmed his information, saying that now they were in the defense period, but there were really a lot of people. We just had to watch and wait, because soon half of them would be expelled. Of course, at that moment Richard said that professors are tied to the students. During this time, professors are not allowed to personally communicate with students, and exceptions are also forbidden. It's even forbidden to do harm. After this period is over, a great many are expelled. Someone who performed poorly, who didn't reach the top, who broke the rules, handed and cheated homework, and so on. Richard gave out an incredible amount of information. However, he assured that if you go down, you can become the leader of your sphere for perhaps an entire era of the continent. Our protagonist caught fire, and Richard immediately rolled over on the bed and said that he thought that then you can become anything but a member of the royal family. But still someone would be willing to give up the princess for such a man. From that point on, our character decided he was going to be very busy. Richard of course hinted at money, but at the same moment a suitcase came out from under the floor. Simon said that he had a subspace as well as a skeleton kit for an island ratman. He'd bought the kit to train with. Richard couldn't believe it, because he had just left school to train again, and this time he would assemble it correctly. But our hero only said that he would listen to his intuition. Within seconds, the mouse was ready. Richard said he had assembled one just like it in class. But at that moment our protagonist said that this time it took him less time, but still his legs are wobbly. A second later, the mouse was smashed. Richard couldn't understand why his friend had done that. However, our staff only remembered that skeletons tend to recreate their shape. He began to feel all the bones around him and decided that if he memorized the order, reassembly would not be so difficult. It was at that moment that he applied the regeneration and the bones from around the room began to come together. Richard couldn't believe that a given bone from across the room had flown in and recovered. But it was too late to be surprised. But when would Simon himself go to bed? But Simon only said that he still wanted to practice a little more. Tomorrow, their first lesson would be the dynamics of darkness. At that moment, our protagonist put the mouse in front of him and told him that they would now follow the pattern. He immediately began to connect the bones to make the knees scroll, because the bones should work like humans. But if you turn it the other way, it's these assembly formulas, the standards that necromancers have set over the years, that have come about through much trial and error and so on. Each one has its own reason and meaning, for in repeating the assembly personally, Simon realized how incredible the previous generations of necromancers had been. It was at this point that he switched numbers 25 and 31. He realized that the mouse was not comfortable and began to put everything back together. He realized that there was always the most efficient option. How do we get to him any faster? Since everything was so complicated, he had to go through everything as thoroughly as possible. The skeletons his father had summoned to help the workers, as well as the skeletons Lorraine had used in the battle with that gang. What is he lacking compared to them? It is for this reason that our protagonist can't wait for the next lesson in any way. The next lesson has come. The teacher talks about how dynamics are very important. But what kind of miracle creates black magic in the first place? To answer this question, one must understand where the very flow of darkness, runes and mechanisms come from. It is the runic words that came from behind the eternal fire of the Temple of Del. At first, no one wondered why the torch never went out. But why? Because in those days, people didn't doubt the existence of God. But then one day they noticed that the ashes from the torch looked like symbols. People were shocked that behind a miracle like the usual eternal fire are simple words. That's how the runic language came to be. But the spellcasters and necromancers who discovered these ancient runic words made countless improvements to create modern runes. After this teaching, runic words became easier to understand. These two magic circles on the board are direct proof of that. After these words, quite a large amount of time had passed. The professor said that for the next lesson he would have a task. He asked to use the basis of the impossible to activate magic circle, which he showed in class, and improve it so that it would work. Many of the students came out, but Richard thought the dynamics were very complicated. It reminded him of his father's arithmetic lessons. But why do you need to know everything? Simon immediately said that of course he didn't understand more than half of it, but he really liked the way the professor described everything in order. Richard even realized that his friend probably liked it very much in Cajun. By that time all the students had gone outside because they had a lesson in magical fighting. Jane asked them to go forward and noticed that they were all being attacked by hippos. They surrounded all the guys, no one knew what to do. However, at the same moment the person who was sitting on the hippo said that Professor Hoppin was giving a lesson on the mountain today, so they would have to climb on the hippo. Richard immediately went up to our protagonist and told him that he was not surprised at what they had been told, because he had heard that there was a strange weirdo living on the mountain. However, is it even possible to ride hippos as riding animals? One of the students at this point started yelling that he wouldn't ride a hippo without a map. The guy on the hippo side and then climbed up high. He immediately jumped on top of the guy who started to arise and asked him how newcomers could be so But after a few seconds the students shouting stopped, so the half-bald man asked everyone to get on the hippos because they were running late. After a few seconds Richard and Simon climbed on the hippo, but a third student climbed on. A girl of rather short stature. Judging by the wings behind her, she was a succubus or something. After a few seconds, as the hippos began to run, many students just did not understand how to keep up with the running. Whoa, all interfered with each other, but the guy said that it is better not to fall off them, for people just trampled. After the hippos stopped and the students made a break, they began to distribute bottles of water. The girl sat and realized that she was very thirsty until she heard loud words that were not understandable. For some reason, the teacher had confused the words, which could mean that she didn't really have much contact with people. Hoppington Sokum Marlette came out. She was the one who would be teaching the new students magical combat this semester. In front of us stood the giant undead monster that burned the lands of the 4 feudal lords to the ground, Hydra Kundar. It had become a legend among necromancers, as a person who had fought this monster for 5 days and broken all of its 100 necks single-handedly achieved victory. Professor of the magic field. The teacher immediately asked everyone to stand in a column of 4 people, but again she said it in error, so we had to figure it out. At one point, the teacher just started running. But of course many people couldn't keep up, they were very tired, and the teacher kept running. She said that in her magic combat class they would study and strengthen the body with darkness and learn strategies. Necromancers who specialize in magical combat are called combat necromancers. If one reaches a certain level in training like them, darkness will flow in their body like silk and form a robe. This is exactly the skill of all martial necromancers. At this point, the professor asked to go further, but warned that there were many trees further on. Our protagonist could not understand what it means to be talented in magical combat. But at the same moment he noticed that many people began to jump through the trees, while Richard was incredibly tired behind. Simon even said that he used to have a lot of mountains in the village where he lived, so he was used to this. The teacher looked at all the kids and then stopped in front of the cliff. She immediately said that all the children would have to go over it. But how would they do it? By using their peculiarity, of course. Because instead of gathering the darkness in the palm of your hand, it could be channeled to your feet. She asked everyone to follow her and started doing tricks in the air. She said that if everyone saw, they would also have to do a double jump in the air. Because when they jump, it would be worth it to send the theme again and spray it. As soon as she said this, she immediately jumped over the abyss. Many students began to try this method, but they still succeeded. Our protagonist decided to think it over while Richard told him not to get worked up and immediately went forward. While Richard flew, he was overtaken by Hector, who clearly wanted to show himself at his best. Our protagonist at this point decided to check everything. He went up in the air, everyone shouted in his direction. However, as soon as he landed, everyone was shocked, even the professor. She said that he did a great job, which made Hector very angry. As soon as the children crossed the cliff, the professor said that they should pick up the fallen students and go on. Of course, Richard asked to see one thing that our character could not guess. Richard showed us a list of students who should try to take group lessons. They would start next week, so he thought they should start preparing, and he had already found everyone's names, strength, and character on the list. Richard had said that they were starting next week, so he thought they'd better start preparing, and he'd already found everyone's names, strength, and character on the lists. But where he had found so much information, Richard decided to keep silent. Then our Simon realized that as long as he followed all the instructions of the teachers, Richard was able to find time to observe the social ones even during the lessons, studying everything about them, who and what they get along with and so on. But what does Richard himself have to say about all this? Richard immediately said that most of the students in their class were very experienced, very cool. But the girl who was with them on the hippo was the one who could be expelled as soon as the student protection period was over. Only 2 people couldn't jump over the chasm, and she's one of them. She's the one who's very shy and she's going to have a hard time. But as soon as Richard wanted to say something else, the professor immediately started to withdraw. At that moment, all the students noticed that a huge crowd of hippopotamuses was coming at them. Our protagonist immediately decided to dodge with the help of this skill, which he learned. He could not understand, because Richard told him that during the defense of students, they are not in danger. Those who couldn't dodge could be injured. But as soon as he looked at everyone, he noticed that everyone was using their own way. He thought it wasn't worth worrying about anyone. He was already very upset, so Richard asked him not to worry too much because all the hippos were under the professor's control. While Richard was on the stick, they saw that the hippos were just running around the fallen boys. It was at this point that the teacher asked everyone to stand up. The girl was shocked, but it was already time to set off again. It was at this point that the professor asked all the guys to come up to her. All the students were shocked because they found themselves in an incredibly clean and beautiful field. The professor said that they could rest, and since everyone was tired, she called the academy and decided to serve lunch to everyone. Immediately, all the students became very happy. Our protagonist immediately began to say that their professor is very different from what he had heard about her. However, as soon as he told everything to Richard, he said that he couldn't believe that his friend believed in such stories. However, the professor asked everyone to get ready because they had 10 minutes left. Only our character had a strange feeling that this was the beginning. It was. Many people immediately approached the professor, who asked them to let some darkness into their bodies. As soon as they let some in, they felt tired and sore. The professor said that everyone should get to the hill with the curse, and she would watch them as they got to the flag. But did the professor actually say that at all? Is it all legal? But at the same moment the professor made it clear that she wasn't kidding, she immediately ordered everyone to start. All the students, as soon as they started climbing the mountain, began to use everything that was under their feet and hands, whether it was rocks or just grass. Each step was incredibly difficult and dizzying, but it was nothing compared to the preparatory training. It was all about stamina and willpower. If Simon failed here, he wouldn't be able to catch up with the rest of the class. That was the feeling that drove him now, and he realized that he would do absolutely anything no matter what. At the same moment, Hector came into view, making it clear that he was ahead of his class for a reason. Hector activated some kind of curse weakening, but still did not understand why our character even keeps up with him. Moore immediately started climbing more and more. He thought that this time he would crush our hero. Both men had already stretched out their hands, but then came the foot of a certain girl. It was Malin, whom the teacher asked to tell how she had gotten so fast. But Malin only replied that there was nothing to her credit, she had just solved the formula and lifted the curse. Both boys were shocked because they did not know that it was possible to lift the curse. But as soon as the professor was distracted, she was informed that they had a student with a sprained ankle. The professor ran, but also asked all the students to get further away. Hector was pissed off, so he also removed the curse from himself and went forward. Our main character was just shocked from such a picture. Hector immediately went up to Malin and asked her if she thought she deserved the first place. Didn't she think that he couldn't break the curse as well? But Malin just said she didn't care. Hector took that as an insult to the princess who lived in the tower, so Malin had no choice but to offer to fight. Hector said he would refuse, but still said he was telling the truth because professors don't grade them during the defense period. It's just important to show that you're doing well to get their attention. But what Malin ordered now would definitely take away her confidence in Hector. Malin immediately lost her temper. She asked if he was just upset because he came in second place. Why is he taking it out on her? But Hector immediately turned away and said he had no interest in her. By then, Simon had made it up the mountain in third place. 2 people looked at him, but after a few minutes the rest of the students started to come up. Richard thought he was dead. He was so tired of everything. As soon as it was over, the professor came over and brought a cloth. She said that since everyone looked very tired, she had contacted Kazan and was allowed to use the teleportation circle. Everyone was overjoyed, so the teleportation of students started immediately. A lot of students came through. As soon as Simon teleported, it seemed strange to him because everything looked more like a hovel. But at the same moment, the professor came over and asked him to sit down and said that there was actually an unknown modification to the magic circle. So she asked to examine it and found out that someone had added a formula to make it react to the darkness of a particular person. That particular person was Simon. So when the formula activated, it would have gone somewhere other than Kazan. Is there any idea who could have done this? Simon said no, so the professor only said that it was in her house, not anywhere else. However, there was one thing she wanted to discuss, even though it was forbidden to talk to students during the period. But from what she'd seen, there were already professors who had violated it. She asked if he would like to get out his profile for magical battles. The professor said that she could accept him as a student. She would be responsible for the training that the professors do. She also said that it's a very rare opportunity, as you can only take 3 students a year. How does he like the idea? Our hero of course replied that he didn't know how to answer, because he didn't perform well on the morning of the professor's 5th key. He could hardly keep up with everyone else and only came in 3rd. He said that the professor's decision was wrong. However, the professor just crossed her arms and said that students may need skills and rankings, but professors need talent. She asked if this was the first time he had used darkness to jump. After all, if it was the first time, he had already jumped the highest. He was the one who used willpower and stamina when climbing the hill, unlike those two. So even though he had already demonstrated the best. The professor looked at her student's face and immediately asked if he wanted more compliments. Because if he did, she could confidently say that she could make him stronger than anyone else in a few years. But at the same moment, our main protagonist stood up and apologized because he would rather refuse. The professor couldn't understand why it was like that. But our Simon said he just wanted to go deeper into another field. The professor immediately reached out and said that she would then try harder during the year to change his measures. When asked why she was doing so, she said that out of pure curiosity, she wanted to see how strong he would become and how far it could all go. So since that was the case, she now used a circle on the ground and asked him to walk into it. She asked him to come to her if he needed anything. She also told him that she would see him in the next class. At the same moment, another student of the professor came into the room. Who could not understand how Simon refused such an offer, he immediately asked to offer to become Hector's student. However, at that moment the girl said that she had seen many geniuses in Cajun, but had never met one like Simon. By that time it was already evening, many people were going to the bath, but why did our hero came so late? Of course Simon told everything, but Richard began to say that the unreal happened to him. When he teleported in the circle, his body was just the back of his head. And when he came to himself, he found himself in a completely incomprehensible place, more precisely in the office of Bahel. However, instead of talking about what Richard was thinking, Bahel made him scrub his office, but even so, Richard said that he could still hope to become Bahel's apprentice. Hector came up to him and asked him not to make fun of him. He was sure that Bahel would not take such a sloppy apprentice. But Richard did not react. He only asked Hector not to be sad that the professors were not looking at him all the time. Hector at the same moment asked him to stop joking. But Richard obviously started to sarcasm, which made Hector lose his temper. At the same moment he used magic to nail Richard to one of the walls. Richard started to gasp, but even now he found a moment to give the bastard the middle finger. Hector began to stop, asking him to stop, but even at this moment Hector threw away all his assistants. Our protagonist had no choice but to hit Hector, and that's exactly what he was waiting for. Hector thought it was time for a man-to-man showdown, but as soon as he calmed down a bit, he noticed that soap was flying in his direction. It was Kajin, who asked everyone to calm down. Everyone had heard rumors about him, so they almost fainted, but Hector asked him to be careful because he would not let him get away with it. Our character thanked him, but Kajin immediately turned around and left. As soon as he left, our character asked Richard to look at all this and let him realize that Kajin is not such a bad person. Finally the weekend came, but what was Simon going to do? Of course he had no plans, which upset Richard, and he said he was going to Rochester, a town nearby. Richard said he was going to plan a business there. It is Keeson that provides all the benefits to its students, but the amount is not enough to live on when you go to high school. However, Richard thinks he can still get an academic scholarship, but grades are hard to earn. For this reason, he will invest in earning as much as possible. However, it is our protagonist should also think about it, because professors will not give extracurricular material for free. When the period of protection of students is over, this all surprised our hero, and he remembered the words of the teacher that his subject will cost a penny. Of course, Simon did not think that he would have to work so hard, so Richard said that he would go to the neighboring town for now. But then he waved to our hero and said that Kazan should not catch him. By that time Richard had already left, and Kajin, to whom our hero wanted to give a gift for the rescue, just did not appear. So what to do? However, at that very moment, an outline appeared at the end. It was Neftis, who would be very happy to be let in because she had climbed to the 4th floor. By then, Neftis had asked how things were going at school. Our protagonist immediately began to say that the first week was great, that he was very interested in everything. At first it was a little difficult, but his new friend helped him to get used to it. Neftis immediately started laughing, saying that she thought it would be a bit difficult at the beginning. But it was good that he was used to Kajin. It reminded her of when Richard was a student. Of course, it was strange that Simon was the one acting like an adult, but his father was too smart and caused a lot of trouble. He was making fun of the professors, trying to run away from classes, so that several times we had to drag him back by force. All this made our staff worried, because his father at home was different. But Neftis immediately told us that he had flunked out in the 2nd year when he said that Kaizen was too easy. Neftis had never had such a student, and she was also too young. However, at the same moment she stood up and said that Richard had just turned the whole island upside down. If you look closely, you can find his footprints. However, if it comes to that, then Neftis just leaves. As soon as she flew out the window, a letter flew out. Simon wanted to return it, but Neftis was gone, so he thought it was meant for him. At that moment, there was a map on the letter. But is this the treasure that Neftis was talking about? As soon as our protagonist walked to this place, he could not believe the picture. Is it exactly where he wanted to go? At this point we could see that of course he wanted to go there, so the next day he was actually facing danger. Of course he realized that he would not go back, because for the sake of this he was getting permission not to go back at night. It would just be a terrible waste. Of course he realized that in front of him was a sign of monsters, but they were not to be feared, they were in his townspeople. It was at this point that he walked forward, and the first thing he met was a monster in the bushes. The monster immediately attacked Simon. Our character realized it was pretty fast, but what kind of monster was it? Was it a werewolf? Of course it wasn't an adult, but if it had happened before his arrival in Kaizen, it would have escaped for sure. At that moment, Simon activated his mice and decided that he would attack the werewolf with them. Once the werewolf attacked, he was able to destroy one of the mice, but the other one was able to strike. Time after time, the mouse's dagger gets deeper and deeper, and at the very last moment, our protagonist decides to add a wolf. When he finished with the werewolf, he realized it was kind of his first fight since he got in. Thank God he'd been practicing skeleton collecting, because if he'd met such a monster in Les Hill, he'd have run away. But now he could defeat a real werewolf after only 3 days in Kaizen. How strong would he become? At this point it was noticeable that one of the mice was badly bruised, so the next fight was definitely not to be snatched away. Our heroes went further but found nothing. Hence, everything was probably underground. It was good that Simon had brought a shovel with him. After a few seconds, they reached some solid rock. But was it a rock? They dug deeper, so they found a device that reacts to darkness. However, once the darkness got in there a little bit, it started to open up spaces from the stairs down. Our protagonist had a smile on his face, and the mouse kept watching everything. By that time our character passed into a kind of darkness. Of course there was a skull lying there, there was an altar. By the time our main character walked further in, he noticed that there were runes or ruins all over the room, so most likely they were in a huge magical device. By that point, the mouse called our character over to him. He showed him a certain skull. Our main character looked at it and realized that the owner of this skull is actually dangerous, but what was it doing here? At the same moment Simon was frightened, because a skeleton fell on them. Of course he was not sure how the undead would behave when it woke up from its sleep. Maybe it would even try to harm him, but it was still worth a try. That's when the time was right. Darkness began to spread across his skull. Simon had awakened the skeleton, so all that was left was to collect it. By then, he was almost there. He was glad that he hadn't studied hard for nothing, so if it wasn't for that, he wouldn't have been able to assemble the skeleton all night. But why was this skeleton so big in the first place? However, still that one looked incredibly cool, but what to do with it? It was at this moment that something started to happen. The skeleton began to laugh, the room began to change, and the skeleton said that he could not understand who interrupted his dream. Did the person in front of him do all this? Who was in front of him? Simon said he was Simon Valencia. The skeleton laughed and said that he was probably Richard's descendant. But Simon said that the skeleton was a little too much because he was Richard's son. Of course, at this point the skeleton immediately began to say that there were similarities, because only Richard could have woken him up. But who is this skeleton? At that moment the skeleton said that he was Fear, the battalion commander, and more precisely he and Simon's father used to rule this contingent. At the same moment our protagonist was in shock. But Fear began to ask questions, because who brought him to him in the first place? Simon immediately said it was Nephthys, so Fear laughed and asked for a contract. Simon didn't understand the contract, so Fear said that the battalion would become his force and destroy anyone who got in his way. The whole world would bow the knee to him, but he would be obliged to follow the path of bloody destruction. It would become part of his destiny. At the same moment, Fear began to shout and ask if Richard's son was ready. At the same moment, Simon began to say that he did not know if the undead would be useful to him, what kind of battalion, and so on. Skeleton appreciated the question and said he would answer it. He said that their battalion is so strong that it is ready to destroy Kaysen. But Richard is the first battalion leader who gave up on them all and sealed them there. So now that he's awakened him, the whole battalion is alive. If he releases the power of the sealed battalion and restores the power of the past, no one on the continent will be able to stop him. Our character said that he was ready to make a contract, so at that moment Fear put him on the camp and asked him to put his hand on the core. He also said that his life would change dramatically after the contract, but if he was even afraid, he could refuse. But even though he was afraid, Simon said that if they were really his father's battalion, he was obliged to accept them. Of course, at this moment Fear thought that he was a calm and polite child, but even so he had all the qualities of a ruler. Fear said that Richard had brought him up in the best possible way, and then asked him not to die because the contract was beginning to be concluded. By that time our character just fell on the altar of everything, and Fear could not understand whether he died or not, so even asked the mouse. After some time our hero woke up. He asked if the contract is ready. Fear replied that everything is like that, and also asked to feel his core, which became larger. Simon said that before, his body was overflowing as soon as he slowed down a bit, but now he felt comfortable, as if he were in warm water. Once that was said, Fear asked him to become content, for he was now one of the 7 battalion commanders. However, as soon as Simon tried to say something, he felt dizzy. Fear asked him not to get too worked up, but our hero just wanted to ask him something. He asked what is a battalion. Fear immediately began to shout, because did he not know what it was? Now it would take Fear a while to realize what kind of person he was looking at, so he decided to sit down and ask him how much he knew about the undead. Our hero said as much as any first timer. Fear started to shout again, but then he remembered Richard and calmed down. Hap decided to put things in plain English. He said that the undead world is divided into 3 groups: the summoned, the natural, and the battalion undead. The first 0 all those who are controlled by necromancers like our protagonist, the summoned undead. Such undead are artificially created with black magic and so on. The natural undead are created without black magic or the help of necromancers. When people think of the undead, that's what they imagine. Because of the blind hatred of living creatures and extreme aggression of the undead, people think of monsters as the latter, a battalion, something in between. They are similar to the natural undead. MBO can exist on their own with their own cores, but can also obey orders. There are 7 battalions in the world. In other words, there are 7 necromancers who can control them, and now Simon has become one of them. Simply put, a necromancer summoner can lead a squad-sized group of undead. When his summoning skills improve, the size of the undead also increases. But what about the necromancers who graduated from Kesen? Surely there must be talents there. Fear said that he was right, because they are high-level necromancers, but they are inefficient. The summoned undead move based on the darkness of the summoner, and the summoning and control of the undead is an attribute of darkness and mental powers, so it's obvious that large armies are problematic to control. Of course, our Simon remembered the moment with the bear when it was destroyed, which caused a lot of pain, and Fisher said that this is exactly the case because the summoned undead are connected to the necromancer. Great damage, pain summoner, but the undead battalion moves on its own, so they have no limits. This allows you to operate an infinite number of undead. If anyone had heard of an undead army of millions at all, it was most likely one of the battalion. Are there any questions left for our character at all? So since the contract was already finalized, they were in the same boat, it would be worth talking about plans. Of course, Fear asked if he was a first-year officer. Yes, and does he want to leave? But immediately our protagonist said that it is to defy the will of his father, and he is very interested. But what are the circumstances of the skeleton? At the same moment he said that there is a more important thing, because at the moment his battalion is an open enemy of necromancers. They are criminals, and it happened because of the crime of the commander, his father Richard. It was at this point that Richard's words that he was not allowed to visit one of the kingdoms were remembered. That committed a crime that does not forgive in the world of black magic, and his battalion also shoes in this crime. His father committed a crime. Richard loved a saint. Years of war between necromancers and saints then still continued, and even despite the times he gave his battalion orders to protect his love, namely to attack the necromancers who came to kill her. It was Fiera's battalion that committed many murders. This order remains valid even after the battalion is dissolved, so for this reason they can't go out in the open. Our Simon asked Fear if Fear was angry with his father, but Fear only replied that there shouldn't be such a feeling, but in fact, and his son stresses him out. However, he still asked not to feel guilty about it. After all, it was his father's will, and the way it was Richard who was a complete every day, bringing girls to tears, annoying professors, skipping classes, and now he had a son. It was at that moment that Fear realized one thing: Richard's son was sitting in front of him. Simon Valencia immediately made his cute face and said that the skeleton was right, because his mother's name was Anna Falentia. The skeleton immediately jumped aside. At this point, the skeleton understands what situation he is in, because in front of him is a boy the son of his friend and at the same time Viva. How is this even possible? All these images immediately began to flash through the skeleton's mind. He will even start having bad dreams soon. The skeleton immediately fell to the ground and began rolling around like a child, while our protagonist told him not to worry because he couldn't wait to finally work with his new friend. But the skeleton made it clear that he definitely didn't like such jokes. He immediately squatted down and said that our main character couldn't be changed anyway, so he asked us to start talking. He said that from now on, all you have to do is choose a profile in the cauldron and get stronger, and that you can't tell anyone that you own a battalion. When asked why, Skeleton said that because Simon is not an outsider, but Richard's son, the older ones might not be angry at Simon just because of Richard himself. And more importantly, how do other necromancers react when they find out that a Nubian Cajun owns a battalion? However, did the skeleton think that stronger necromancers could just come after him? Fear immediately replied that his new master was thinking in the right way, but what did he decide? Simona immediately said that he should get stronger. The skeleton replied that he wasn't wrong this time either, so he would have to learn everything he could on Epiphany, then the battalion would regain its former strength. You also need to find a way to lead the battalion, despite the special circumstances. The skeleton even suggested something, and he immediately called the mouse over and pointed at the lamp. The mouse immediately ran to the place where Fear pointed, which made it clear that he can also control the skeletons of our character, because now they share the same darkness. For this reason, all the skeletons summoned by his darkness belong to the battalion, and he is the main one in management, and Fear himself is the second in power, but these undead did not even register for the battalion. Our character didn't understand what Fear was talking about, so the skeleton just asked us to take a closer look. Just then, he pointed his hand at the mouse and began pouring darkness into it. The mouse immediately began to rise into the air, darkness enveloped him, and a few seconds later he fell to the ground with a new glow in his eyes. Fear said the registration was successful. Our protagonist couldn't see anything at first, but then he noticed the glow in his eyes just like we did. Fear, he said that registration is the process of turning the undead into a natural one, because now the mouse has a core. However, if he brings him to school, then the mouse will definitely be seen and revealed. But Fear said that not all undead should be taken to school, because if the undead have not existed for a long time, like him, then in battle and to gain knowledge it will be better to use the summoned one. All he had to do was leave the mouse here and summon a new one at the school, as he usually did. But if any of his undead creatures expired or were seriously injured, they should be brought to the feeder, who would register them with the battalion and leave them there. It all sounded like a pretty good plan, because all that was left to do was try to become incredible and strong for Simon. Only then would he be able to summon many types of undead and the battalion's strength would increase. Once the dialogue was over, they both hit each other's fists, and then Simon noticed that the mouse was acting strange now, but Fear calmed him down. He said that he just picked up some characteristics from the naturally undead, but our character still had the power, so he would come if Simon called his. But how long does a boy go to Cajun? Our hero replied that it was only 3 days, so Fear had to tell him that the fun wasn't going to start anytime soon, because the next event was when the teachers would start handing out assignments in Cajun. But when the time comes, then Fear will go along with him, so he will have the opportunity to manage the battalion and gather forces spread across the continent. Our character said that apparently the skeleton is aware of Cajun, to which he got that it was all because of our hero's father, because during his entire stay at school, he constantly mumbled about school, but does the boy want to know more about it? Simon immediately responded positively, so why didn't summoned undead sometimes lose their necromancer? So Fear drew some pictures on the floor and began to say that the summoner lacks an understanding of the undead. You can't judge the undead with your meager knowledge, because the undead are driven by a strong belief in the underworld. Simply put, the most similar concept is willpower. For example, you hate someone very much, you dream of killing that person several times, so the undead will also remember the will. This only meant that when the undead learned the host's will, they would kill that person when the host wasn't around. And it doesn't matter if you don't feel that way anymore, or if you've forgotten about that person at all, the undead will remember the will of the Eternal. However, even if our main character is tense about this, Fear promises that he will warn him about the Candace, because it also helps to understand the world from the perspective of the undead. Simon thanked his new teacher, so Fisher said that since this was the conversation, he would show Simon how to give orders to the undead to attack someone. But the important condition was that it did strengthen the will, regardless of the goal. For example, you had to imagine that the wall behind Simon was the enemy. You should have hated that wall as much as you could. Our protagonist immediately decided to check all this. He began to think that this wall is his worst enemy, attacked the family. Time after time, thought after thought, but the mouse became more aggressive. Fear, he said that the harder the necromancer thinks, the stronger the driving, so the more negative emotions, the stronger. But at the same time, the skeleton asked to stop the mouse. Simon thought for a moment, then started asking the mouse to stop. When the mouse didn't listen, Simon decided to take a stance and said in a gruff voice that reached the mouse. The mouse immediately obeyed, which surprised the skeleton very much, because he noticed that the person in front of him had mastered the absolute command. But what kind of monster did Richard raise anyway? By the time it was over, Simon thought that he had failed, that he couldn't even control his own undead. However, Fisher said that just the opposite is true, that this area is not worth staying in, so you should train every day so that the undead obey the first time. Of course, Fear said it was all due to stress, and what he had just seen was a shock. Our main character sat down on the floor to catch his breath. He said that they would rest a little and return to Kizan because he only has permission to knock. Fear immediately asked if it was true. After all, if so, then I threw it to him. As soon as our protagonist opened his hand, he saw a certain icon in the skull. It was an alternative identity of Fear, through which you could contact the skeleton at any time, so do not worry, even if you get into trouble. It was after this that Simon promised to return in a week, which the skeleton was very much looking forward to. But as soon as our hero entered Kizan, he realized that taking this badge was a mistake. He was talking incessantly about everything. I was the one who wanted to see what would happen next, because now our Simon was writing the exam. The night before, Richard and Simon had decided to prepare for everything. They were thinking that they only had 2 classes tomorrow, and there will just be work in groups. After distribution, the group remains unchanged until the end of the semester. For this reason, it is extremely important for survival in Kizan. At first, the most important thing was that the group consists of 4 people. Best of all, if each of them is good at something specific. For example, Richard knows a little about everything, but the dynamics of darkness are the best, but Simon likes summoning the most. These guys already have a good balance, so Richard started saying that they only have 9 subjects, starting with catarology and ending with magic combat. Among all these subjects, the largest percentage of third-year students are in catarology, dark dynamics, and summoning, which is why they are called the 3 necromancer sciences. At this point, it means that the group already had 2 of the 3 subjects that will need to be studied. But what to do with the remaining space? Of course, so much information poured into Simon's head that he couldn't even find the words. But Richard at one point fell silent and began to look sarcastically, saying that he already had a special list of guys who should be taken to the team. But by this point, we can see the very exam in front of them was Jane Olivia, who could have eliminated a year 3 student. But at the same time, Olivia herself spoke to Richard, saying that life is full of unforeseen situations, so if someone keeps talking, she will consider everything as a result that was written off. Of course, she started saying that no one knew why she was there, so he explained very clearly. It is she who will lead Class 1A, so she hopes that no one will disappoint him with the difference in skills and also concentrate on the exam. It was at this point that our Simon realized that he didn't know anything. Even if he had a battalion of evil spirits under his command, it didn't mean that he would easily stay in Kizan. But our character understood that he would not just give up, he would definitely fight to the end. By the time the entire exam was over, Olivia was seeing everyone out of the classroom and decided to start checking out papers with other professors. But at that moment, Nephthys ran up to her and was immediately hit on the head. Olivia immediately started giving orders to everyone else, but Nephthys kept complaining, saying that Olivia used to be a very different and cute girl. Olivia immediately said that since Nephthys was here, she would want to check out a few exams herself. At this point, Olivia came across a job where a person solved only the most difficult number and could not solve the simplest one. Olivia immediately asked Nephthys why she had assigned her to the first years, or should Verena say Simon? But Nephthys just took it and smiled maliciously. Then we see what really happened. The names of the works were pasted over because this was blind testing. Of course, Nephthys also checked the papers. She said that many students are very but Olivia found interesting instances, such as how one student in a row was able to write down the elements of toxicology, but in the next question he could not do anything, although the answer was the same. Nephthys even wanted to see the person who wrote it. But by the time Olivia found an interesting job, she looked and saw that the boy did not cope with most of the simple tasks, but he coped with the most difficult. He used formulas, but they are almost always wrong. He would just grab the surface knowledge and then use what he could learn in the last week, as if he hadn't done anything at all before. Nephthys immediately took a look at this paper and noticed that the student used a formula from the book in the problem of calculating the amount of darkness. But is the answer correct? At the same time, Olivia said that the answer will differ by 146 units from the real one. Olivia immediately tore the name off and asked why Nephthys had assigned her to the first years, or rather to Simon. Nephthys immediately stuck out her tongue and said she didn't know. Olivia immediately started complaining that the Chancellor was acting like a child, even though she was 300 years old. By that time, the results were already posted. Many people looked at their results, were quite surprised. But Simon was not so happy with the results, although he scored a lot of points on the call. Richard immediately slapped his friend on the back of the head and said that it was really worth choosing one, but how was Richard doing? Richard said that the highest score was for the dynamics of TM, but the rest averaged 6 to -70. However, there was still one problem. Now with the results, it will be more difficult to find a group. At the same time, Olivia came in and said that she was now giving everyone 30 minutes to form groups, so if there were no unforeseen circumstances, their group would remain like this for the rest of the semester, and from then on, Black Magic would be a group event. Everyone will have individual scores, so Ticho would need to choose a partner wisely. Immediately there was a commotion, everyone started looking for a group, and our protagonist started looking for a girl, second on the list, then third, fourth, but everyone was already talking to others. So our hero decided that the catalog was the most important thing for them right now, but even now the best students were just watching, so it would be worth making your choice and going to the soul itself. Our character just walked up to Madeline. Everyone was shocked by this choice, but Malin asked if it was just a matter of her joining them. However, she believes only valuable people whom she chooses, and he invites her when he has an average score of only 30. Immediately, everyone started talking about it, and Malin started saying that he was only good at summoning, that she was better at everything. But at the same time, our protagonist said that in a month's time, he would be better at summoning than she was, and if he couldn't, he would leave Kizan. Malin immediately began to say that he was probably making a himself, that he should have left immediately if that was the case. But all Simon said was that he was proposing to her, not to himself. Of course, Malin thought that she should keep the first place for the first semester, but the biggest obstacle is Hector. She was able to surpass him in the written exams, but not in the combat tasks. To get around it, you need to succeed in group classes, and Zany says that she will have to fill in the gap in the summon, the only subject where she is not so good. Right now, NY is being approached by a guy with the first admission to academies, a guy who wins Hector without a preparatory course. But should she even look for a guy with a score higher than his in the draft, or place bets on it? So at the same time, she stood up and asked if he would keep his word if anything happened. But Simon just held out his hand and said that no matter what, he would keep his words. As soon as he agreed and shook Malin's hand, Richard ran over, clearly happy about everything. He started to say that he was happy and so on. But Malin pressed her hand to her face, which clearly gave away her feelings. About the whole situation, she said that she would not let Richard rest just like that. By then, the entire group was discussing what they were still missing, and how many points did Richard have for dark dynamics in general. Richard immediately said that he had 74 points for the dynamics of darkness. Even so, he's kind of happy that they now have a picky genius girl in the group. But they still have to take it in general. Malin immediately said that she chose someone with good grades in hematology because it saves time and makes many calculations easier. As soon as all this was said, Richard went to find a new ally. At this moment, the two heroes remained silent as everyone looked at them. So Malin was the first to ask questions. She asked why she had never heard his name, where did he live anyway? Simon immediately said that he was the heir to a small plot of land in the Baldwin Kingdom. His family manages the number. But what about Malin? Of course, Malin thought it was a joke, but then she realized that it wasn't really a joke, that our hero didn't really know what it was or who she was, so Malin started saying that her tower was called the Magic Tower 300 years ago. I even told Serna about the past, but Malin immediately asked me not to mention her, so it's probably a pretty sore subject. But are all noble children that complicated? As soon as the conversation was over, Richard came in and said that he had brought a new member, whose name was Ursula. She immediately bowed and asked me to call her Kami. Of course, they immediately started talking to her, which is not worth the formalities because they are all in the same class. However, of course she is not a succubus. She said that she is from the vampire family, which surprised everyone very much, but Malin immediately asked no one to be so surprised by this. But Kami also asked no one to be surprised because her mother is a human. Of course, Richard immediately started apologizing, but he told me not to do it again and asked me to tell you a little more about myself, so Richard started first. He said that he was a commoner, the son of the owner of the White Cow Trading Group. Of course, Kami was surprised, isn't this the largest group? But all Richard said was that he was the third of the 8, and his older brother was the heir, so he would get everything. Basically, he's just on a mission in Cajun to figure out Necromancer needs and make a market report. Richard was incredibly motivated. He believed that he would definitely graduate from Kazan and create his own merchant group in honor. He thought that he would definitely become a leader. By that time, the group was approached by the supervisor, who was very surprised that the group was talking at all, so he asked them to enter the names of the group member and the subject on which they planned to focus, and also then choose the name and letter of the group. The name of the group is not very important, but the leader must be there. Immediately, the guys decided that Malin would become the leader, but what would they call their group? At the same time, for some reason, the team was named Team Number 7 in honor of the fact that it was the 7th group in the account. Of course, many people wanted to have their own name, but why is it such a bad taste at all? It was at this point that you could see that many groups were assembled, but not as well as our heroes. Everything became much worse than before. Many guys left one group for another. Many people were upset, but you definitely shouldn't have worried about others, because the backlog in the cauldron literally means a ticket home. However, Malin thought that there was nothing cruel in this because just someone lacks effort, skills. What did they do from the first day in their school? The supervisor immediately came in and said that the time was up. Many were upset, many were angry, but the girl said that it is better to remember and try to forget about evil. It was at this point that the teacher said that from the next moment, the students' defense ends, and they will fight with one monster. Everyone was shocked, so at the same time, the teacher said that this monster is a cyclops. The students immediately did not understand anything, because will they be able to fight with him at all? But the girl immediately asked to be quiet. She said that they were going to the Keshkian dungeon with their group to defeat the Cyclops, but only one student would personally fight it, the other three would stay behind to support the fighter and weaken the monster. The girl said that attacks from summoned creatures are also allowed, but direct necromancer magic, including true magic, simply cannot be used. The girl said that for more details it would be necessary to refer to the papers. Na also said that for the sake of safety, the fighter will be protected by a vest with a barrier spell, and the score will depend on their success in the fight, but also takes into account speed, stability, teamwork and creativity, as well as the degree of completion of black magic. To defeat the Cyclops, they will have to improve all their abilities to the maximum before the test begins. Everyone was listening intently, but she ended abruptly and asked if there were any questions. James immediately raised his hand and asked if they would fight with a real Cyclops or with some kind of simulation from the academy, but the girl replied that they had caught the living, and also said that she had forgotten to mention that before the test began, they must sign a document accepting all risks. The whole class was taken aback, but the boy raised his hand and asked what would happen if he didn't defeat Cyclops, but the girl again only replied that she would not count anything, they would get a minimum grade. A loss is also counted in 3 cases: when the fighting team member can no longer fight, when the professor forbids the continuation of the fight, or when everyone gives up. Malin was saying at that moment that in a fight with a real Cyclops, we would have to work out tactics, while our protagonist was just glowing at the thought. At the same time, Richard asked who was going to fight, but Malin immediately said that she was. Simon also wondered, but what would happen if someone was too fast in magic combat? Kami also thought about it. She understood that Cyclops attacks weren't that weak, so it wouldn't be easy to defend against them with black magic, and it would take too much of the darkness to defend, so it would be better to avoid attacks. They argued that students with magical combat would prefer physical attacks to magical ones, but Richard said on the contrary that their skins were too thick to penetrate. But even so, they will spend too much effort and stamina. Kami immediately moved closer and asked Malin what was her plan, but Malin only said that she had one, but did not say what it was. By that time, the girl at the blackboard was already finishing her conversation. She said that there were 3 lessons of elementary black magic left before the group performance, and in the first lesson, each group will present its own battle strategy. In the second lesson, they will get a virtual experience, but in the third lesson, they will fight for real life. At the same time, the teacher said that they still had time to discuss all the issues that were gnawing at them. Richard immediately looked down at his desk. He was very tired, but Malin asked me to listen to her with a smile on her face. She immediately began to use elementary dark magic and summoned a flash of darkness, which surprised Richard very much because did Malin really know this spell? But our main character was just amazed, so Malin said that she would start explaining now. She said that she would fight Cyclops first and use the flash of darkness, and they would support her with a curse. Ronnie would use the curse to salt the Cyclops, and she, in turn, would simply make it burn alive. Of course, Richard started talking at this point, and he said that Malin probably forgot about teamwork, because if only she showed her best side, they wouldn't get any points for teamwork. But at the same time, our character asked her if she could create a flash of darkness while dodging Cyclops attacks. Richard said that they were just worried that she wouldn't be able to do it. After all, she even left the abyss during the test. Malin didn't appreciate the joke, so they immediately started fighting with Richard. Kami tried to calm everyone down, but at the same time, our person put his foot on the desk and firmly stated that he was distracting Cyclops with his saves, and Kami and Richard were using it. Your strengths and become a better support. What could Kami possibly do? Of course, she said that she would be able to provide support with curses, while Richard said that he would also start training fatigue. The professor was already finishing up, saying that by the next lesson, she would need to provide a 10-minute presentation of her strategy against Cyclops, that it was necessary to specify the roles of everyone. At this point, everyone was already scattered, and someone was thinking about Simon in a better way, saying that now he understands why he has the first admission. But my thoughts were interrupted by Richard telling me that the cafe was having steak tonight. The whole group moved forward, and by the time everyone left the cafe, Malin started shouting that she didn't get the steak. At this point, they started a new toxicology class with teacher Landstrass in front of them. He asked everyone to open the tutorial on page 1, and so on. All the students were very bored, everyone was just sleeping. By then, the professor had finished explaining something and said that they could create the first potion. Everyone woke up, But at the same moment they saw that the professor was coughing up blood. He just worked really hard, so another girl came to replace him. She noticed that one of the students was asleep, so I immediately threw a textbook at him to wake him up. She started yelling at everyone to wake up, and how dare they even be rude to the professor. How could she possibly just fall asleep in the middle of class when these were actually Kizun's students? She immediately began telling Tutu that she was Professor Land's assistant, Francesca Belmond, so that they would not forget about at least minimal losses Belmond. Today, instead of the professor, the lesson will be conducted by her. She said that they would all be making low-quality potions today, so it was worth putting all the textbooks aside. She said that the key to creating these potions is not to control the quantity and order of ingredients, but to be adept at performing the process. She began to say that first you had to light a fire, wait for the water to boil, pour the powders inside, and so on. The girl asked, how much does it cost to pour the powder? But Belmont said they should pour as much as they want. It was this potion that began to smell incredibly as Simon noticed. Belmont asked if anyone had blue smoke. If so, they will make a paralyzing potion, and if the potion is green, they will make a potion for nausea and dizziness. Of course, our hero did not know about this method, but the girl continued to say that those who have green smoke, it would be worth hanging their jackets on chairs. Assistants will give them the necessary ingredients. Immediately, the professor started approaching each student, telling them what they should do and what they shouldn't do. Step by step, she went to each of them until one of the students asked if it was okay that her potion turned yellow. The professor replied that it was not just good, but wonderful, because the shade of yellow potion is the best quality potion. If the potion changed color from blue to green, then most likely the ingredients just surfaced from the cauldron. Richard, on the other hand, had already told our Simon that he now understood why Professor Land was staying afloat at this school, all because of the assistant. It was at this point that our protagonist finished his journey. The two friends sat side by side and asked what would happen if they took the given weapon with them against Cyclops. Is everything worth a try? But Malin, with her yellow-hued potion, said that potions like theirs wouldn't do any harm to the opponent. Richard, of course, did not get upset. He just said that he was unlucky. But our hero continued to leaf through the textbook, where they found licarc mushrooms, which his mother used to add to his soup and neutralize. But what about Malin? What does she think? Malin was immediately surprised and asked, which page is it on? Of course, Tutu also started all the people in the group saying that this potion is just perfect. It's called Nervier. It's a neuroparalytic, weakens the muscles, and it was also written that it works on almost all monsters. If you use it on a Cyclops, you can at least weaken it. By that time, the team immediately started discussing their plan, and they started talking about just learning how to prepare it. But Kami had said at the time that most of the last 3 ingredients would be hard to find, so Richard said that he would go to Rochester today and find them by the end of the day. Our hero also volunteered. He said that he would help with licarc mushrooms because there are a lot of them growing in his homeland. Even in the Forbidden Forest they are there. Of course, immediately all the students began to say that you can't do this, you can't just go to the Forbidden Forest. But our hero said that he would do everything himself, do at least something. Balin started shouting that he might be attacked by monsters and so on, so Kami couldn't help but say that he would go with Simon. Malin shouted at her that it was all very dangerous, but Kami did not want to calm her down. She said that 2 heads are better than 1. Our protagonist agreed, so now the distribution was like that. Back Kami and Simon were going for mushrooms, Richard was mining blood Suleiman and silk vines, and Malin was looking for basic ingredients in Cajun. In the evening, they promised that they would meet in the laboratory. At this moment, a certain guy was listening in on their conversation. He was smiling very hard, and then he approached Hector and told him that he had some useful information. By the time we can see Kami, as well as our main character, they have already arrived at the place where they needed to go. We understand that they entered this forest through a secret passage that only a few people knew about. Richard said that the soldiers near the Forbidden Forest had already finished patrolling, so they wouldn't be coming back anytime soon. But it was never safe, so he asked them to come back as soon as possible. Kami and our character thanked him, and Simon couldn't understand why Kami looked so enthusiastic at all. But she only said that she liked to go out at night. She said she was very comfortable at night. Kami immediately stood behind our protagonist and said that she was very grateful for his help in the battle magic lesson. She just couldn't get up on her own, so she asked for help, but everyone ignored her. She knew there was a lot of competition in Cajun and so on, but he was the only one who dared to give her a hand. Simon was about to say that he just did what he had to do, but Kami immediately interrupted him and said that this is what makes him an incredible person. This situation was somewhat awkward, so our hero decided to change the subject, saying that she was finally able to find licarc mushrooms. He didn't know how much he needed, but he decided to collect as much as he had. Our main character removed the mushrooms in his space, and Kami asked him what brought him to Kizun, but he only replied that it was just his parents who sent him there. But when he learned to summon, he abruptly began to become a Necromancer. But what about Kami? At this moment, they noticed that people were approaching them. It is clear that they were checking, or Kizun's guards who hunt monsters in the forest. Kami knew that if they were caught, they could be expelled. What had happened? Why had the guards come, even if Richard had said they wouldn't be here? Kami started to get very worried, but Simon immediately put his hand on her shoulder and told her not to worry, saying that everything would be fine. He said he had an idea, so all you had to do was trust him and look only at his back. By then, Simon had contacted Fear right away, and he said that he was in a bit of a mess, so the battalion should do some work. Kami had finished her work by then, or rather collected all the stones in the area, just as our protagonist told her. At the same time, Simon said it was time to start. He immediately let the rat loose while the guards searched. They were distracted, so our heroes decided to run away. The dogs noticed our characters, so they chased after them. The only thing worth doing was to use a Kami spell, which she's good at. After a few seconds, the guards also noticed our heroes and opened fire on them. Kami was afraid that they would hit them with an arrow, but Simon said that there was no need to worry either, since the guards wouldn't hurt them since they had seen their student uniforms. By then, the guards were already using magic, so all Kami and Simon had to do was run away. At one point, they reached a cliff and our main character asked Kami if she remembered a lesson in combat magic. Kami said to be left behind by our character, that she would be fine, she wouldn't talk about him. But Simon just begged her to be patient, picked her up, and headed for the cliff. At one point, he was able to cross the cliff and asked if Kami was okay, but she just started crying and said that she was very scared. She thought that she would be caught, so our main character had to calm her down. Kami immediately decided that she should stop crying and said that then everything is fine. At one point, Kami thought they were lost, but our main character said that everything was fine. Of course, at that moment, Kami said that there was a voice around, definitely not owls. Our protagonist listened, so at one point we decided to look behind the bushes. He noticed that a man was praying there, that he was offering some kind of birth sacrifice. Kami collapsed at the sight, but the person who was there immediately turned to face them. It was clear that he was determined, and he immediately used his abilities and looked up from his prayer. Our Simon realized that this was not just a saint who used black magic, but a real traitor to their academy. Kami was very scared. She said that she couldn't believe all this, and our hero only told her that he knew something else. He knows that if they just stand there right now, they will definitely be killed right now. And so it turned out, while Kami was running forward, crosses were trying to hit her in every possible way. At one point, Kami's legs were tied up and then she was pulled towards the traitor. He tried to hit the body of our main character in every possible way, so that Tom had no choice but to use his inventory and get a sword. But the sword was of such poor quality that it immediately broke from the impact. It was necessary to use all his methods, so Simon decided to at least throw some darkness in his opponent's face. But at the same time, the traitor became even more dangerous, so Charamchan had no choice but to tell Fear that now it was his turn. At the same time, Fear himself appeared behind the traitor. The traitor was shocked, but he didn't even make a sound. So Fear said that now was his time, since it had been a long time since he had been in combat. While both of them were fighting, Simon decided to approach Kami and take her back. Apparently, she just passed out from Fear. Fear was saying at this point that a fight wouldn't be very easy, because the man in front of him knew the dark as well as any professor. However, at one point our protagonist looked at everything and said that Fear should only listen to his orders because he had a plan. Fear looked at Simon and said that he trusted him because he was Richard's son. By that time, for some reason, everything was over, our main character was able to escape, and also ordered Fear to retreat. The latter was rather shocked by this act. He didn't expect the young boy to send guards at the traitor. However, the skeleton was still fine, and the girl on Simon's back definitely needed medical attention. Fear said he'd help them both. Our character thought that he could heal, but Fear only replied that he would just be able to get them to their destination quickly. At the same time, Fear headed towards his target with incredible speed. As soon as they got there, Fear said that they were going to walk now, and also that it seemed like he couldn't go any further. He also asked us to be more careful with our main character in the future, because they have a contract. He just can't lose Simon so quickly. As soon as the skeleton left, our protagonist couldn't decide what to do with Kami. Where would he even cure her? After all, at the central point, he would be asked how she got hurt, which would bring more trouble, and besides, that saint could also see their faces. He was definitely a traitor. She had to be treated by someone trusted. This is exactly what he will most likely go to. A few minutes later, we see the night watchman. She was sitting in her office when she saw someone banging on her door. Simon was standing behind her, the one that held Kami. The girl immediately started saying that the girl is not allowed in this dorm and so on, and then noticed that Kami was injured. She said that she should be taken to the infirmary, but this time the character replied that he simply could not do this. He said that she should be treated here. The attendant had no choice but to sigh and say to have him carry her to the bunk. Of course, the girl said that nothing would happen to the girl because most of the wounds, bruises, and scratches will be cut off with something sharp. But still, she said that if they were sharing a gift with other students, then it should be resolved as quickly as possible. Also, don't worry about everything, because she has a friend who will take Kami to her room. Simon immediately bowed to the girl and said that he was very grateful to her for everything. As soon as our protagonist left the door, the girl only realized that such people are not very often found in Kijin. At this point, as soon as our main character returned to his room, Richard fell on him, who simply could not find a place for himself all this time. He said that he was also being chased by the guards, that Malin had postponed brewing the potion. But since the heroes were back in the dorm, all they had to do was go to rest. As soon as the lights were turned off, our hero thought that his mother was a saint, so it wasn't the first time he saw prayers, but Kami was clearly shocked. She should definitely talk to her tomorrow morning. As soon as the next morning arrived, she came up to our hero and said that everything was alright with her, that last night was like a dream. She said that yesterday they went for a walk at night, picking mushrooms and hiding from the chase. At first everything was fine, and then it began to turn into a nightmare. But at one point our main character took her by the shoulder and said that the saint saw his face, but not Kami's face. He asked her not to tell anything and no one about it, that he would find the saint. However, Kami only stood on tiptoe and said that she would also help, that Simon couldn't leave her out. Nothing went wrong for our main character than just to agree. Kami immediately left, and in the following classes, our main protagonist was depressed. They had a magic lesson from Yahello, who taught them about the transmission curse, which allows them to transmit darkness. Time after time, our Simon tried to use circles and so on, but he didn't succeed. However, Shoe Covers came up and asked if everything was working out. Our character started saying that he was trying, but so far nothing is working out. But Yahello immediately said the answer. He said that it is worth using the core, because he still has not gained experience, so the darkness is not solid enough, which is why the magic circle is formed incorrectly. Yahello immediately said that you can't just learn how to use the core Kizuna, and it's too basic a skill for Kizum. It was at this point that Yahello used a certain spell with which Simon will be able to feel everything several times better. Yahello asked him to inhale and collect the air in his body. Run it through your core. At the same time, Simon noticed that the core was moving differently between his shoe covers and his own. It is the darkness on his character that is not the same as everyone else's, so if he uses it only to get darkness, then there will be no effectiveness. It is for this reason that it is better to develop circulation. Yahello only asked that you start treating your core as if it were a living thing. Our hero was starting to get everything right, so at the same time, Yahello said that now it was his turn, that you should not try to control the core, but just let it do what it wants. Our protagonist was able to do the first stage, so the shoe covers reduced the sensitivity to 50%. Yahello also gave another piece of advice at this point, saying that darkness has its own tendency to remember its flow, that it works just like his hands. After all, if it is repeated hundreds, then thousands of times, then the darkness reminds you to perform actions without awareness, so for this reason it is worth practicing again and again. At this point, Yahello asked our hero to create a curse. Our Simon said that he would try, so at the same time, Yahello got up behind him and started telling him what to do. The circle was formed and then activated. From one flower grew a huge tree. Everyone was in shock. Simon didn't understand what it was. But Yahello only replied that this is his potential, and Yahello only helped him use his strength qualitatively. It was Simon's darkness that was special. It is up to him to decide how he will use his special darkness. At one point, our character fell silent, and then asked Shoe Covers to tell us about the curse that he created in more detail. Yahello only smiled at this point and said that our character has a great mindset that allows you to look at yourself objectively, but his curse still needs more emotions. Our protagonist immediately said that it was just like controlling the undead, which made Yahello worry, but then he came to his senses and said that emotions are the most important factor in black magic. Our main character, of course, was frightened by the face of his professor, but still was a TC leavin'. Yahello was walking to his seat when Richard raised his hand. He said he wasn't getting anywhere, but this time Shoe Covers said that all newbies are lazy just waiting to be spoon-fed, so all he had to do was try. Malin laughed, but our Simon was thinking about learning as much as possible during the lesson. While Kami and Richard were sitting in class, Richard asked if they were giving Simon too much time. After all, everyone is kind to him and so on, especially Professor Hongpyeong. At the same time, Kami watched as the professor engaged with our main character and then asked him to use everything what she taught him. At the same time, Simon did his own thing. Anak, who was very surprised by the professor herself, she said that our character was good, that he did a great job, and Simon at that moment could not even believe it. Of course, the teacher decided to say that not everything was perfect, because you need to move your back normally, turn your heels more often and harder, and the darkness also stands out too quickly. Our hero didn't say anything else, except that he would try better next time, but the professor only said that he was doing great. At that moment, Malin came over and asked Richard how he even became a student of Cajun with such an attitude to study. Why doesn't he try to get stronger every moment, but just sit on the floor and continue to whine? But Richard immediately said that he wasn't offended, it was just a question. However, at the same time, he even told Malin that she was also made problematic, to which Malin replied that she wasn't problematic. Immediately, the two of them started fighting, and Kami kept trying to calm them down. But at the same time, Malin called our friend and asked him to teach her. She said that he wasn't bad at magic combat, so if the professor wasn't working with her, he might as well help. After all, it is she who will have to fight Cyclops, so she needs their help in developing faster movements and the scores will definitely be higher. Of course, our character asked her not to explain anything more because he was so eager to help her if it would all be in her favor. However, as soon as Malin tried to do a few moves, the whole group told her that her performance was just terrible, to which Malin replied that she knew everything so well. Our main character immediately said that she was too tense. It was very obvious that she was not sure, so she should try to relax her body and take the most natural position. Time after time, he gave her instructions on where to put her foot, where not to put it, how to put her feet, how to bend her back. The group still didn't understand how Malin could be so bad at something like magic combat, but by then our main protagonist was still training Milne, who thought she was doing just fine. Simon immediately said that she was still doing things wrong, and he asked her to make it look like she was hitting with all her strength. More instructions followed, and once again Malin became nervous. At one point, she couldn't stand it, and then said that since Simon knows how and where to put his foot, you can just touch it and put it in a comfortable position. But as soon as Malin said that, the entire class froze, and the words started to slip through their minds. But it was already too late. Our character had already approached her and started groping her. He showed her where the darkness should accumulate and where to move her foot. At the same time, Malin was a little confused again, but our protagonist asked her not to think about unnecessary things if she wanted to learn something. Malin agreed, and then tried to gather all the darkness where she wanted and was shown. Of course, she did it, she was happy, but then she just took it and fell to the floor. Sure enough, Simon came up to her and told her that despite her fall, she had done well, but there was still a lot to learn. At the same time, many girls began to approach our hero and ask him to teach them the pose as well, and Malin could not understand who was standing in front of him at all. At this point, our Simon went to the summoning lesson. The teacher talked about the benefits of skeletons and then showed how they can be restored. It showed that even when a skeleton's body collapses from extreme shock, there is still darkness in its bones. You just need to activate it and maximize the ability of the game, which will pull the bones together into one single original structure. It was at this point that the practice began, and many students did not succeed. Malin noticed that our main character was just sitting there staring at a book. She asked if it was normal for him to do nothing at all, but at the same time, our character just took and assembled the skeleton, which showed Malin that he was not bad. However, then she immediately told him not to get conceited because he didn't seem to forget about the promise. But our main character didn't even forget. However, at the same time, Malin said that she herself could get 90 points for summoning if she decided on number 20. However, at the same time, our protagonist asked if she was talking about number 20. Is this the special task on the last page that was easy? But Malin decided not to believe all this. She asked if anyone could find the answer at all without going and attending preparatory classes. What kind of response did he get? But as soon as our character said the answer, Malin was just in shock. She immediately started asking him how he did it. But one thing prevented them. They were prevented by the coming of a teacher who could not understand what the children were doing. Simon replied that he had already mastered this lesson, so he was reviewing the data for the next lesson. The teacher looked at our protagonist and then asked him to come back after class. Malin begged for forgiveness. She thought it was her fault. At this point, we can notice that the teacher was sitting at the blackboard. It was evening. He closed his book and asked me to follow him. While they were outside, the teacher talked about how he didn't like a few things. He said that one of them is when students do not learn from him in class, even if they want to. At the same time, the teacher asked to restore the skeleton that he had destroyed. Our protagonist, through the pain in his head, immediately did it. The teacher didn't say anything at first, but as Atmi said that the student was actually talented in recovery, so he would teach him another skill. Of course, our character immediately started asking if they were going to punish him for being inconsiderate. However, the teacher said that this is not a punishment, but an additional lesson. He immediately said that he said this so that the professor would not misunderstand, because the role of a professor is to give students who are above the mass of the class additional chances. Simon just glowed, and Aaron asked him to take a pose, and also not to keep him waiting for so long. At the same time, Aaron revealed that the skeleton was made up of demon bones. He said he wouldn't show it twice, so you had to watch carefully. At this moment, he revealed an attack skill that uses recovery. The skeleton's bones soared into the air, then immediately sped towards the tree. The bones crashed into a tree, and Aaron said that this skill is called bone piercing, as well as another skill related to recovery, Costane Prison. After all, the dice just surrounded their target. There was also a third skill, defense skill, or rather bone armor. Of course, our main character said that this is simply incredible, and Aaron said that it is from the ability of a necromancer that a skeleton can become a weapon, armor, and prison. All the black magic skills that he showed him are in addition to recovery, but did our hero understand? Simon immediately said that he understood, so Aaron had to say that all these skills were taught only in his second year, but he was already doing quite well in recovery, so he would teach him these skills earlier. Of course, he said that it is better to start with a penetrating bone, but before that it is worth getting rid of one wrong habit in recovery. Aaron said that the essence of recovery is to send the skeleton to the location, but restoring it puts the skull in the center. In other words, instead of moving a fully restored skeleton, Simon must initially set his will so that the skeleton is restored in the right place. Of course, Fear said something similar to our protagonist, so maybe he can do something similar to the skeleton. It was at this point that our main character ordered the skeleton to gather in front of him. Everything worked out, so Aaron said that now we can start with the next one. He said recovery and pranza.zy are two different skills, and the latter is just a supplement to the recovery power, so it was worth thinking of them as two different things. One had to make a habit of turning the dice during recovery, so that was how the sharp ends would stick into the opponent's flesh. If you focus the darkness in a bone in one direction, you can even make a bone out of it. For those bones that do not have clear parts, it was necessary and possible to make a movement limiter. At one point, time after time, our main character tried to recreate Professor Aaron's skill, which he did. Aaron said he was good at it, but so far, he's basically just choking the enemy with bones. But the way it rebuilds the skeleton into an attack mode is a new feature. You only had to get cold feet to use it in battle. Of course, at this point, Aaron asked if our character would fight during the challenge against Cyclops, but he said that it would be Malin, that Aaron would appreciate it. He said it was important to focus on supporting your friends, because Tom still has a lot to learn. He also said that it was nothing more than an extra lesson. Our protagonist said that he would definitely try, looking at how the professor goes into the distance. At that moment, he walked over to his group, who immediately rolled out of the door at him. They were very concerned about what had happened, but at the same time, Simon said that Professor Aaron had given him an extra lesson, most likely he just confused it with a punishment. As soon as Simon said all this, he noticed that everyone immediately moved away from him, asking to see their potion. Of course, the potion turned out the same yellow shade. They said that everything is just perfect, but it still needs to stand on the fire for 20 minutes. They all thought that it would be prepared for the presentation, and they went through all the answers. They were very tired. However, as soon as they presented their work to the professor, he said that their members of the team do not have roles, and besides, the combination of black magic is very lacking in creativity. Even the main idea is to put the main damager in position. What do the boats of the 7th group even think about? Of course, the whole group was very worried, because the professor in front of them did not ask any of the 300 questions they were preparing for. But the professor asked why they wanted to distribute the roles in this way. Malin volunteered and said what she thought that the best solution would be to clearly divide the responsibilities, because the most important goal is still to defeat the Cyclops. But what does Simon think about it? Of course, he knew that the professor probably expected a different answer, but in any case, it was all about protecting the students. The purpose of the presentation today is to evaluate the strategy, so you shouldn't have shaken up and show how good a team they had. At the same time, he began to say that first of all, he knew that their team lacked resourcefulness in terms of combining dark magic, but still one thing came first: safety. He said that the hunting of anicaps in their party would be more stable than in all groups, so that they would get a high strength score, which would make up for the lack of points in resourcefulness. At the same time, the professor decided to move on to the next point, turning to Kami. She said that she was the one responsible for the hematology, and therefore she would be responsible for the attack. But it was at this point that she gave her role to another student studying catarrhology. The professor herself would like to hear the answer to this question. The whole group was in a state of confusion. They understood that they just had to answer confidently. Our character reminded her about Cyclops, so at the same time Kami came back to normal, she said that their decision is due to the unique nature of the cycles that they will fight against. The professor asked her to explain what she was saying, so Kami said that the unique nature of Tsupovo is hard and hard skin, and hematic spells are more suitable for physical damage, so it will be difficult to defeat such a spell. Malin is the one who is able to cast Flash of Darkness, a dark element spell, so she thinks they can just burn the chickens with her spell. It is for this reason that Malin is more suitable for the role of a striker against Cyclops. The professor asked, but what would happen if their enemy was another monster? Kami thought for a moment, then shouted that she would go on the offensive herself. Everyone was shocked. Kami also blushed, and then the professor smiled, appreciating the decision and saying that she would remember it all. The professor asked Richard to be prepared for the answer. Richard held out his hand, said he was ready, but the professor only told him not to chat with the students standing nearby, and then that the squad could be released. Richard was shocked, but there was nothing he could do. By then, we can spot Simon waiting for someone in the cafe. He knows that he just has to meet her. It was at this moment that all the students were simply shocked. Someone entered the hall. It was Lorraine. She immediately shooed away all those who were behind her, but our protagonist could not understand what kind of person was sitting in front of him, why she was so scary this time, despite how friendly she was when they were together. He immediately started saying that it had been a long time, clearly feeling a little embarrassed and afraid. But at the same time, Lorraine's face changed, and she started asking him how he was doing, and so on. This change in mood was simply a shock. At the same time, Lorraine took out the letter and asked what Simon had said to the girl who had brought it to her, because she had made a big fuss. But our main character only said that he asked her to compose a letter and nothing more. At the same time, he looked at Lorraine and said that she looked better in this uniform than he had even expected. Immediately, Lorraine moved closer to Simon and asked him if he thought she looked that old. However, at the same time, Simon was so scared that she began to try to prove her words in every possible way. But Lauren only said that she was joking, and then asked why he wanted to see her. It was at this point that our main character decided to tell her that there was a traitor in Kijin. He told her the whole story. Lorraine listened all the time, so Simon thought she didn't believe him, but Lorraine just said she did, and then asked him to describe the cross in more detail. Our protagonist immediately said that the biggest one was the central cross, and there was a woman on it. Of course, Lorraine immediately learned that this was the Virgin Goddess, the only goddess that the Saints of Eiffel believe in. Simon asked again, and Lorraine said it was a holy college run by the Holy Father himself. Kazan takes in necromancers, and Eiffel takes in priests. Holy maidens are generally considered the strongest in the Holy Federation, and they only take a wench and keep the entire Federation with them. How do you even get to Kazan after the priest? Lorraine was incredibly angry at all of this, and then asked who else knew about it. Our character said he only knew Kami, that she went mushroom picking with him, so Dorian said she would tell her mom. Simon thanked him, and Lorraine immediately left the table and told him that it was a good idea to tell her. It is all the information that our hero Lorraine said that can only mean that every professor can be suspected, so even if he talked to him, he could destroy all the evidence. It is thanks to this that Neftis should definitely make an investigation and figure it out. However, as soon as that was said, Lorraine said that they needed to go to the same place. Our hero asked where, but Lorraine only replied that to the Forbidden Forest, because there may be evidence there, but as soon as both heroes arrived at the scene, nothing happened. Our character just couldn't believe it. He just swore that everything should have been there, but now there were no footprints, no priest. Of course, Lorraine had said that without evidence, things were even more suspicious, because as Simon had said, but the priest was strong. Even though Lorraine couldn't see anything, she knew they were covering their tracks carefully. What was even more shocking was that they put the core inside to come to Kizan, even though they serve God. The priests believe that the core is a force that denies God. However, at the same time, our main character asked what would happen if you unscrew the core. Can he use sanctity? Lorraine said that all she knows is that holiness is a power of the gods that comes from faith, and darkness is the power of a cursed demon. Whatever their theory, there was no denying that the two forces were fighting each other. However, at the same time, Lorraine put her hand on our hero's shoulder and said that the problem is not that the priest should not be underestimated, but that most likely our character's life is just an Asdi. They don't even know when they will all come, so why don't our main protagonist take a day off? But all Simon said was that it was alright, he was just going on with his normal life, because she didn't even know if the priest had seen his face or not, and if they came after him, they would definitely make up evidence. At the same time, Lorraine started shouting that Simon shouldn't risk his life for some klitzes. But our main character took her by the shoulders and said that if he just stopped going to couples, or doing something strange, the priest would immediately suspect him. Everything applies to this condition, because as soon as our character speaks to the priest, it will definitely stand out, and then it will become obvious that he told everything to the top of the Kijin. Lorraine wanted to exclaim again, but our hero only told her that they were dealing with the priest who had entered the Kisar, because as she said, they were the ones who decided to come there and even opened the core of what he considered sinful. She should have known that fanatics can be unpredictable. Lorraine said that everything was fine, but then warned that if she noticed anything suspicious, she would immediately provide protection behind Simon's back, even if it would limit his freedom, and it was also worth remembering that you don't have to sacrifice yourself for everyone stylish. Since that was the end of the conversation, Lorraine suggested that we return to Cajun. However, as soon as both of them started returning to the academy, our main character understood that he simply couldn't take a sabbatical just for the sake of it. He will fall behind the others if he does not complete tasks. What happens if he is expelled altogether for poor academic performance or poor skills? He just can't let it happen, even if there is a risk on both sides. It was absolutely necessary to save your life in the training school, like Fear had said, but there was too much to learn in Cajun. Next, we see that Group 7 and other students are already being sent to a new task from the teacher. They understood that this happens in the second semester, but they do it before the school period is over. At the same time, all the heroes were told that they were in Avalon, in a system that only Keikaisen has on the entire continent. She can recreate any monster in the form of a magical creature for virtual combat. This is the result of moving the hallucinator of the ancient fortress of illusions and hallucinations. But once the professor explains everything, she can go straight to the ability briefing. She said there were some rules. They will face a maximum of 3 virtual battles for the present. Virtual Cyclops will only consider the fighting group as enemies. It is the students who will wear a certain vest with a barrier. In this virtual battle, it was possible to assess how well they worked as a team. So once that was done, the professor asked to be sent to the designated waiting rooms. Group 5 that our character was looking at was Cindy, and that team had a great balance. At one point, a Cyclops appeared, so Cindy immediately decided to take the fight. But one Cyclops strike removed half of the barrier per hit. The curse should definitely have been used much earlier, but whether or not Maylene will be alright, she's a nervous wreck. Maylene assured everyone that everything was fine, and then the next groups came out, that is, the 7th and 8th. Hector, who was standing nearby, asked if Simon was an attacker in the group, but he said it was Maylene, which made Hector laugh. He asked if he was just going to defend her honor, but our protagonist only said that this is simply the best fighter among them. At this point, our estimate group entered the site. They were shown auxiliary positions, asked if they were ready. They also said that if they got out of the circle, everything would be shaken up. At one point, everyone was trying to support Maylene to stop worrying, and then Cyclops appeared. Maylene immediately asked him to remember their strategy. Simon thought they should just concentrate on their role, everything would be fine. However, at the same time, Cyclops made his first strike, after which he flew to the side. It was at this point that the first virtual battle ended. Everyone was praised for their work, but the Necromancer, who was able to distract the orc thanks to his summon Seba, especially expressed the teacher. But the other members of the group performed much worse than the rest. The biggest problem in their subsurface waste mastermind, it was only necessary to reduce the number of line misses, that was all. However, as soon as they left their hall, they saw that Hector was able to kill the orc with just a simple typo. 97% of the shield's strength, which only meant that the Cyclops almost didn't hit the target. Was it even possible? However, as soon as Hector came out of the basement, he smiled very aggrievedly, which allowed Maylene to understand that she would now take the fight seriously. By that time, the second attempt has been started. Many people thought that Cyclo wasn't even subject to curses, but what should they do anyway? Syl was still exposed to the second spell by then. He moved away a bit, and then began to look at M Island lying under him without strength. It only means the end. Maylene couldn't help it. There was one last attempt left. They thought they were close, but at the same time, our chief grumbler asked him to listen. He said he had an idea for a fancy lunch. He said that the base of the plan is the same as 2 rounds with a curse, and Maylene uses a flash of darkness, but double depletion did not work, so now Kami and Richard will use 4-layer depletion with many formulas. Of course, Richard and Kami never did this, because it would probably take a long time. At this point, our protagonist said that there was no need to worry about this, because with the help of skeletons, he would try to buy as much time as possible. It was at this point that the test itself began. To begin with, the summoned creatures began to climb the Cyclops. Richard had to use all of his abilities, but Kami only cast the first stage. Many were worried. Skeleton Crumbling was already going to battle the 7th skeleton. As soon as Kami said that Cyclops was in the depletion radius, everyone said that they were ready too. The 2 of them, along with Dark Flash, immediately charged towards the Cyclops. With the help of exhaustion, the Cyclops will definitely feel out of place. But what should Maylene do anyway? She was immediately told that she could handle it, so our heroes helped Maylene to deal with Cyclops. At one point, the skeletons continued to wait for their order. Kami used a blood bandage to block the Cyclops' eyes, and the skeletons bound the Cyclops so that it couldn't move. The chains were reinforced, and they couldn't be broken just like that, so Maylene used her spell at one point, after which the Cyclops simply fell. The whole group was very happy with what they did. The professor immediately began to congratulate them, and they were told that they had chosen a strategy that was only good in theory and then turned it into a realistic plan after the experience they had gained. But still, they should work on the duration of the battle and the fact that they rely very heavily on the summoner. Strengthening the spell with multiple formulas was also a good solution, but even so, it was very difficult. The conclusion was that they should train even more, and immediately the whole group started saying that they did very well. Many others began to approach, and Cindy came in, who also gave a high five to our main character. A lot of groups surrounded Group 7, which Hector didn't like very much. He was clearly not happy that Simon had attracted attention again. But that was the end of it, and the whole group was supposed to train next time on the weekend. But had Kami been asked out on a date? Maylene was shocked, but Kami said that she refused because she wanted to go practice with our main character. Of course, Richard said that he should also be cut out of the plans because he had to go to Rochester for a business meeting. But what about Simon? He said that tomorrow will be hard, but he will join everyone the day after tomorrow. At the same time, Maylene lost her temper because she understood that Richard was going to be a merchant. But what about Simon? Simon said that he has personal training, because in the growth he has someone who teaches him the call. At the same time, we were given to understand that this teacher was Fear. Of course, at this point, our main character asked Fire if he could look at the skeletons that our protagonist brought. Fear immediately agreed, but as soon as our hero opened his inventory, the skeleton was simply shocked. What is he even going to do with so much? What was Simon doing anyway, that all the skeletons were so injured? Our Simon said that all of them were broken during the simulation, so Fear immediately said that if this was the case, it would be worth starting training. But even so, those it restored will take a long time to recover. A beginner like our main character will have a hard time handling them, so Fear will teach him how to control several skeletons at once. But before that, it was worth saying how many skeletons he even wants to control at the same time. Our main character said that he never got more than 2, because when he tries to control 3 or more, he just gets a mess in his head and it becomes more difficult to give orders. But Fear just came over and said that there was no need to worry, because it didn't matter how many of them he could control at once, but how well he could do it, even if it was just 1 or 2 creatures. So if that was the case, then it would be possible to start a battle and fight 2 skeletons at once. Fear asked his skeletons to attack when Fear asked his skeletons to fight. Of course, it was clear that the difference in experience was huge, that Fear's skeletons were quite well controlled. Our protagonist even thought that he was cheating, but Fear just smiled and said that he didn't do anything wrong. So our hero realized that first he went ahead as a skeleton with a spear, and then he returned to the skeleton with a sword. It was at this point that Fear said it was called cross-checking. So you need to move the skeleton as quickly as possible. If you couldn't manage a few at a time, then it was worth moving all of them 2 at a time, and that was the strategy. At the same time, our main character decided to check it all out and made 2 skeletons give each other a high five. Fear, he said that teaching such a student is just a pleasure, and also asked to go straight to the fight. The goal for today was to master cross-checking. Of course, after that, the study continued. In a moment, we can mark the entire squad. They were very exhausted. They believed that everyone had become much stronger, but it was Simon in particular who had become stronger. He became much better at controlling the skeletons. They said that he used to be able to control only 2 skeletons, but now as many as 3. Is it really thanks to those very private lessons? But who is this person? Really someone familiar or someone else? Our character immediately said that he was a friend of his father's, and everyone began to say that if he felt so much better as a skeleton, then most likely the master is really just a professional in his field. Fear at this point, through the same metal, began to say that he was very popular with the girl, and also said that he would be very happy to teach a lesson for such beautiful ladies if they died and became part of the battalion. Fear was told that this was not allowed, and then Simon said that his teacher didn't like to be out in public. He was very busy, so there was barely enough time for him. Of course, the girls said he was greedy, and Richard said he should have put himself in Simon's shoes. Of course, he won't say anything, because he'll have to leave Cajun if his grades are lower than the girls. It was at this point that Malin stood up and started saying that she would definitely surpass Simon the next day. And so came the sludgy day, on which the protection of students ended. Richard and our main character watched as the students were repeatedly removed from the audience. Richard had already counted 20 students that Battle had asked to leave the academy. In just 1 day of study, 29 students were expelled. At this moment, the magic battle lesson arrived. Richard was almost out of breath, and Malin began to work on her lessons with even more effort. Our protagonist remembered Kami telling us that she had spent the whole day practicing the exhaustion curse yesterday, and Malin had spent the whole day practicing the physical ones. She said that she could use a flash of darkness without any problems, but she couldn't just rely on Simon's words to dodge the blows. After that, she even studied. She never once got up from her chair. So you could say you hadn't slept all day. Kami asked her if she was tired, but Malin said she was fine. Of course, our character praised her for such a tool, but she did not understand why she tried so hard at all. However, at the same time, Malin asked to look at her and demonstrated a leap of darkness. She asked if she should fix it, but Simon said that everything was fine, which made Kami and Malin very happy. But as soon as she spoke, one would notice that her legs were noticeably shabby. Simon had asked her not to overwork, because they'd been through the simulation, so they could relax a little. But Malin said that she couldn't relax so much because she wasn't just interested in the test, she was interested in the first place. By this point, the professor had asked everyone to keep running. But as soon as the race was over, Hoppin approached our protagonist and asked if he was training in this image. What did she show him? Our hero replied that he was, so I immediately started looking at him and telling him that he was actually getting stronger. She had said several times that he was born for magical combat. But as soon as the teacher wanted to continue, one of the professor's assistants came up and said that one of the students was injured, that the ligaments on his leg were sprained. As soon as our character returned to the group, he asked where Malin was, but they didn't know about Richard's fireplace. At this moment, the entire group turned around and saw that Malin was sitting on the back of one of the assistants. The entire group was in shock. As soon as they returned to the medical office, they were met by the doctor, who said that it would be possible to go to lectures, but you cannot attend classes where physical activity is required. Sure enough, Malin immediately got up from the cot and said that she could, but then she felt a sharp pain. The doctor exhaled and said that he wasn't suggesting it right now. He was saying that his words were in order because for Kaizen, student survival is first, but he's a doctor, so that's why recovery is first. He even takes her out of those classes, but I don't want to go. At that moment, Malin was very upset and said that she wanted to be alone. Everyone wanted to leave, but our hero turned to her and said that she should stop drowning in such thoughts. Malin started saying that there was nothing they could do. Tomorrow was the battle with Cyclops that they had been preparing for a whole week. And now they're going to get all the low marks because of her, that it's all her fault. She tried too hard, but she got hurt. But at this point, Simon asked everyone to be quiet, saying that if everyone was happy with it, then he would be incredible. By that time, we can see that all the students were making their way through some ruins. Kami said she couldn't understand how they found so many ruins and so on. But Richard said that Nephthys is a collector, so she probably just moves the ancient ruins to Rook Island when she finds them. So she probably moved everything she found. But still, everyone was more worried about the fact that they would switch places with Malin today. Kami wondered if everything was going to be okay, but Richard said they should just trust Simon. By that time, 6 rooms had already passed, everyone was waiting for the 7th. However, why is Malin injured at all? Is it even possible to participate like this? Everyone couldn't understand why Simon was ahead of them, and Hector was watching. Simon came forward at this point and said that the situation had changed a little, but they were definitely not trying in vain, so he asked them to launch the next Cyclops. Everyone told them that they didn't need to force themselves, that if they felt bad, they should ask them to stop participating. As soon as the first curse was lifted, the Cyclops immediately rushed into battle. The first thing, the skeletons came rushing at him. The skeletons weren't destroyed as the Cyclops headed for Simon. They realized that Cyclops sees what comes first. Sure enough, the skeleton that had crept up from behind tried to attack the Cyclops. As soon as the Cyclops was a little exhausted, Simon decided it was time to let go of the spear. The spear slammed into the Cyclops' face. He was very angry. Of course, our main character at this moment dodged every blow, all thanks to the lessons of the professor. At one point, our